adjusting air.
It is not light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. Frederick Douglass. Chapter 1. The hour was close to twilight, and the vaguely warm hues of the afternoon were fading to colder blues and purples. Air, peppered with swirling, stinging blades of snow, whirled high above Coldara. Other beings would shiver and shield their eyes, fluff their fur or feathers, or wrap themselves more tightly in their cloaks. The great blue dragon, whose wings beat a slow rhythm, paid no heed to such things as snow or cold. He had taken to the air in search of the crisp bite of the frigid, snow-speckled wind, hoping, perhaps futilely, that it would cleanse his thoughts and soothe his spirit. Calicos, though young as dragons reckoned age, had already borne witness to tremendous change among his people. The blue dragons had endured so very much, it seemed to him. They had twice lost their beloved aspect, Malagos, once to insanity for millennia, and then, finally, to death. Ironically and poignantly, the Blues, the intellectuals and the guardians of arcane magic in the world of Azeroth, were the flight most drawn to order and calmness, and the least able to deal with such chaos. Yet, even in the midst of this upheaval, their hearts had stayed true. The spirit of the blue dragonflight had chosen not the hard-line path represented by Malagos's deceased blood heir, Aragos, but the gentler, more joyful way offered to them by Calicos. And that choice had proved to be the right one. Aragos had, in actuality, been betraying the flight, not striving to be a devoted caretaker. He had promised to deliver his people to the evil and quite insane dragon Deathwing, once they had sworn to follow Aragos. Instead, the Blues had joined with the Reds, Greens, and Bronzes, and one unique orc to help bring down that great monster. But as Calicos flew across the darkening sky, the snow below turning lavender, he knew that with that victory, the flights, in a way, had also sacrificed themselves. The aspects were no more, though the dragons who had once been aspects lived on. The defeat of Deathwing had demanded all they could give, and at the end of that battle, though Alexstrasza, Nose Dormu, Ysera, and Calicos still survived, their aspect abilities were gone, poured into the final moment of the struggle. The aspects had been made for this single act. With it accomplished, they had fulfilled their destinies. There was a less direct effect as well. The flights had always had a surety about their roles, a firm understanding of their purpose. But now that the moment for which they had been created had come and gone, what purpose was left to them? Many Blues had already departed. Some had sought his blessing before leaving the Nexus. Calicos continued to be their leader, although the powers of an aspect were no longer his. They had told him that they were restless and wished to see if there was some other place in the world where their skills and abilities would be appreciated. The rest had simply gone. Present one day, vanished the next. Those who remained were either becoming increasingly agitated or surrendering to a bleak sense of malaise. Calicos dove and wheeled, letting the cold air caress his scales, then opening his wings and catching an updraft, his thoughts once again brooding and unhappy. For so long, even during Malagos's insanity, the Blues had had direction. The question of what to do now had been thought and sometimes whispered. Calicos could not help but wonder if he had somehow failed his flight. Had they really been better under the leadership of an insane aspect? The immediate answer was of course not. And yet... He closed his eyes, not against the needle-sharp snow, but in pain. Their hearts trusted me to lead them. I believe I did lead them well then, but now, where do blue dragons, any dragons, fit in a world where the hour of twilight has been prevented, but only an endless night looms before us? He felt utterly alone. He had always deemed himself perhaps the oddest choice possible to lead the blue dragon flight, as he had never really felt like a typical blue dragon. As he flew, despondent and increasingly concerned, he realized that there was at least one who understood him better than most. He leaned to the right, angling his great form slightly, and flapped his wings, heading back toward the Nexus. He knew where he would find her. Kirigosa, daughter of Malagos, clutch sister to Aragos, sat in her human form on one of the magical, luminous floating platforms that encircled the Nexus. She wore only a long, loose dress, and her blue-black hair was not braided. Her back was against one of the shining, silver-white trees that dotted a few of the platforms. Above her, blue dragons wheeled, as they had for centuries, ceaselessly patrolling, although there seemed to be no threat here, not anymore. Kirigosa appeared to pay them no heed, her gaze soft and unfocused. She appeared lost in thought, though what occupied her mind, Kalikos did not know. She did turn to look at him as he drew closer, smiling a little as she realized he was not one of the guardians of the flight's home. He landed on the platform and assumed his half-elven shape. Kiri's smile widened, and she held out a hand to him. He kissed it affectionately and plopped down beside her, extending his long legs and folding his arms behind his head in an effort at nonchalance. "Kalik," she said warmly. "Come to my pondering place?" "Is that what this is?" "For me, yes. The Nexus is my home, so I don't like to go too far, but it can be challenging to be alone inside." She turned to face him. "So I come here and I ponder, just as you seem to want to do." Kalik sighed, realizing that his effort at casualness was lost on this perceptive friend he often thought of as a sister. "I was flying," he said. "You cannot fly away from your duties, or your thoughts," Kirigosa replied gently, reaching to squeeze his arm. "You are our leader, Kalik, and you've guided us well. Aragos would have destroyed the flight and the whole world with it." Kalik frowned, remembering the dire vision that Ysera, the former green dragon aspect, had shared with them all not so long ago. It was the hour of twilight, and showed an Azeroth in which all life was wiped out. From the grass and the insects, to orcs, elves, humans, creatures of air and sea and land, to the mighty aspects themselves, who had each been slain by his or her own unique powers. Deathwing had died then, too, along with the rest of Azeroth, impaled like a grotesque trophy on the spire of Wormrest Temple itself. Kalikos shuddered, disturbed even now by the memory of Ysera's lilting but broken voice relaying the vision. "He would have done that," Kalik said, agreeing with part of her statement, but not all of it. Her blue eyes searched his. "Dear Kalik," she said, "you've always been different." Humor flickered in him, despite his dark mood, and he made a silly face, twisting his handsome half-elven features. Kirigosa laughed. "You see?" "Different is not always a good thing," he said. "It is who you are, and it is because you are different that the flight chose you." The humor melted away, and he regarded her somberly. "But, my dear Kirigosa," he said sadly, "do you think the flight would choose me again, now?" Truth had ever been one of Kirigosa's most cherished ideals. She looked at him, searching for an answer that was both true and comforting, and not finding it. Kalik's heart sank. If this beloved friend, his sweet sister of the spirit, had no encouragement to offer, Then his fears were more real than he had suspected. "What I do think is—" He would never know what she thought, for they were interrupted by a sudden, terrible sound, the cries of blue dragons in despair and anguish. More than a dozen dragons were emerging from the nexus, flying and diving about erratically. One of them abruptly swerved from his fellows, heading straight for Calicos. Calic leaped to his feet, blood draining from his face. Carrie stood beside him, hand to her mouth.
"Lord Calicos!"
Narragos cried.
"We are ruined! All is lost!"
"What has happened?
"Slow down, speak calmly, my friend,"
said Calic, although his own heart lurched within his chest at the sheer panic and terror emanating from Narragos. The other dragon was usually calm, and had been one of the more open-minded blues during the tense time when Calic and Aragos were vying for the role of aspect. To see him so distraught alarmed Calicos.
"The focusing iris, it is gone."
"Gone? What do you mean?"
"It has been stolen."
Calic stared at him, sick with horror, his mind reeling. Not only was the focusing iris an item of immense arcane power, but it was also deeply precious to the blues. It had belonged to them for as long as anyone could remember. Like many such items, it was neither good nor evil in itself, but could be turned to both benevolent and sinister purposes. And it had been used so. In the past, it had diverted the arcane energy of Azeroth to animate a hideous creature that should never have drawn breath. To think it was now lost to them, lost and being controlled by those who might use its power.
"This is exactly why we moved it,"
Calicos murmured. Not 2 days ago, in an effort to avoid this very circumstance, Calicos, along with several others, had recommended moving the focusing iris out of the Eye of Eternity and into a secret hiding place. He recalled his argument to the blues.
"Many of our secrets are already known, and more of our flight leaves each day. There will be those who will be emboldened by this. The Nexus has been violated before, and the focusing iris used for dark purposes. We need to keep it safe. And if much of Azeroth knows by now that the Nexus hosts this artifact, then it is certain that one day it will again be vulnerable."
And that day had come, but not how Calic had anticipated. The blues had decided that a small group would bear it into the frozen sea, off the coast of Caldara, where it would be safely, he had thought, ensconced in enchanted ice. It would be securely hidden, a simple chunk of frozen water that was in reality so much more. Calic struggled for calm.
"What makes you think it's been stolen?"
"Please," he thought, begging what power he did not know.
"Please, let this be simple confusion. We have heard nothing from Varagos or the others, and the focusing iris is not where it should be."
Some of the blues, those who had spent the most time with the artifact over the long centuries, were particularly attuned to it. Calicos had asked them to sense its progress. By this point, the focusing iris should have been on the bottom of the ocean, heavily warded, and those who had borne it there should have been back. There were other possibilities, not nearly as dire, but Calicos was already in his dragon form and flying quickly to the Nexus, with Kiragosa and Narragos right behind him. Because he knew, how he did not understand, that the other possibilities were nothing but false hopes, and that 2 of the worst disasters to befall the Blue Dragonflight had happened while he had been first its aspect, and then its leader, for only a few brief months. Calicos landed inside the cold, cavernous interior of the Nexus to utter chaos. Everyone seemed to be talking at once. Every line of their massive reptilian bodies screamed fear and anger. Some sat hunched and unnaturally still, and these alarmed Calicos even more. How few of them were left, he thought. How few had stayed, and no doubt these few wished they too had departed ere this doom had come upon them. Retaining his true form, he called for silence. Only a handful obeyed. The rest continued to shout among themselves.
How could this have happened? We should have sent more. I told you we should have sent more. This was a fool's idea in the first place. Had it remained here, we could have watched it every moment.
Calicos slammed his tail on the ground.
Silence!
He bellowed, the single word ringing through the chamber. The flight ceased talking all at once, all heads whipping around to regard their leader. Calic saw in several of their expressions a faint flicker of hope that this was some kind of mistake, and that he would somehow make everything right. Others fixed baleful, sullen eyes on him, clearly blaming him for what had transpired.
Once flight does not surrender to fears born of a fevered imagination.
Some of them lowered their heads at that, their ears drooping slightly in shame. Others bridled. Calic would deal with them later. He had to establish the facts.
I sensed it first,
said Terralagos. He was one of the oldest of the Blues who had chosen to stay. Once, he had sided with Calic's rival, Aragos. Since the revelation of Aragos's betrayal and his subsequent death, however, Terralagos and most of the others had maintained their loyalty to Calic, even after his aspect abilities had been lost.
Long have you been a guardian of our home, Terralagos, and great are the thanks all of us owe you,
Calic said, his voice full of respect.
What did you sense? The path that Veragos and the others were to take was not arrow-straight,
Terralagos said. Calic nodded. It had been decided that it would be too obvious to see several blue dragons bearing a mysterious object, flying straight for their goal. Instead, they had opted to travel in bipedal form. It was slower and more roundabout, but would attract much less notice from any hostile forces. And if they were indeed attacked while on the ground, it would be the work of a blink of an eye to shift from humanoid seeming to their true forms. 5 dragons should have been more than a match for anyone who might be skulking about, thinking to ambush what appeared to be a simple caravan. And yet...
I knew every twist and turn of the route,
Terralagos said, continuing.
I and others, Alagosa and Banagos, we followed each step our brothers and sisters took, and until barely an hour ago, all was well.
His voice, raspy with age, cracked on the last word. Calic kept his gaze fastened on Terralagos, but felt Kirigos's head brush against his shoulder in a gentle reassurance.
What happened then?
Then they halted. Before this, progress had not ceased for a moment, and after a pause they began to move again, but not west, not to the frozen sea, southwest, at a speed far faster than the iris had been moving before.
Where was it when it stopped?
At the shores of the sea. Now it has traveled far to the south, and the farther it travels from me, Terralagos said miserably, the less I can sense it.
Calicos looked at Kirigosa.
Take someone with you and go to the shoreline. Be careful. Find out what happened there.
She nodded, spoke to Banagos and Alagosa, and a moment later all 3 were airborne, broad wing beats carrying them out of the nexus. By air, it was a short distance away. They would not be gone long. He hoped.
Oh no,
Kirigosa whispered. She hesitated for a moment, hovering, trying to anticipate any possible lurking threat. She sensed nothing. The enemy was long gone. Only what they had wrought remained. She folded her wings and dropped gracefully to the ground, bending her long, sinuous neck in grief. The sight had once been a plain, if unwelcoming, unmarred expanse of white, pure, clean, calming in its simplicity. The visitor would see nothing but snow, or the occasional brown-gray of rock. In some places, small patches of yellowish sand stretched into the hungry, cold ocean. The snow had been turned to red slush. There were violent black gashes that looked as if lightning strikes had rent the frozen soil, which the whiteness had once blanketed. Boulders had been ripped from the ground, or snapped off the faces of the cliffs and hurled great distances. Some of the boulders, too, were tinged with drying crimson. As Kirigosa and the others sniffed the air, they caught the lingering stench of demonic activity, the coppery reek of blood, and the unique, indescribable fragrance of myriad other magics. More mundane weapons had been used as well. Her sharp eyes caught wounds in the earth that had been made by spears, and here and there arrows had buried themselves up to their fletching.
"The lesser races," growled Banagos.
Her heart aching, Kirigosa did not chide him for the insulting words, as she might otherwise have done. He was right, although so far it was impossible to tell exactly which ones, or even which faction they bore allegiance to. Kirigosa transformed into her human form. Tucking a lock of long, blue-black hair behind an ear, she respectfully approached the bodies of her slain kin. 5 had started out to protect the focusing iris. 5 had been killed, giving their lives attempting to complete their task. Mild-tempered and wise Eurygos, older than the others, the leader of the group. Rulagos and Rulagosa, clutchmates, appearing in human form as twins. They had fallen together, close to each other and in the same pose, arrows piercing their throats, as similar in death as in life. Tears filled her eyes as Kirigosa turned to regard Pelagosa. Kiri could recognize Pelagosa only by her petite size. She had always been among the smallest of the Blues, young, as the dragons reckoned such things, but having a gift with the arcane that surpassed her years. Whoever slew her had also fought with magic, and she was burned beyond recognition. Luragos had perhaps resisted the hardest, given how far away from the murder site they found his body. Scorched, frozen, partially submerged, with arrows sticking out like quills in his shoulders and legs, he had not given up. Kirigosa thought that he might even have fought for a heartbeat or two after his head had been severed from his shoulders in a clean strike from a sharp sword. Banagos, in human shape, came behind her and squeezed her arm. Swiftly, she covered his hand with her own.
"I know little of the lesser races," Banagos said. "I see all kinds of weapons here and evidence that magic was used, demonic and arcane both."
"It could be any race," Kiri said.
"Then perhaps we were on the right track with the idea of killing them all," Banagos said.
His voice was raw with grief, and his blue eyes were reddened with unshed tears. He had loved little Pelagosa, and they would have been mates once she had come of age.
"No," said Kiri sharply. "Such has ever been the sentiment of those who do not take time to think, Banagos, as I know you know, as I know Pelagosa always believed. They do not all do this, any more than all dragons attack wantonly and slay the younger races for sport. We understand why this was done, and it was not for hatred of our people. It was because someone wished to obtain the focusing iris for his or her own purposes."
5 dragons, breathed Alagosa. 5 of us, 5 of our finest. Who could possibly be strong enough to do this?
"That," said Kiri, "is what we need to find out. Banagos, return to the Nexus with this grim news. Alagosa and I will stay here and care for the remains of our fallen."
She had thought to spare him further pain, but Banagos shook his head.
"No, she would have been my mate. I will tend to her, and the others. You were closest to Caligos. It is best that he hear this from you, and quickly."
"As you wish," said Kiri gently. She looked one final time at the bodies of the blue dragons, trapped in death, in a form most of them scorned, closed her eyes in sorrow once more, then leaped skyward. Her wings flapped as she wheeled and turned back for the Nexus. Her thoughts were no longer on the fallen, but on their killers. Who was strong enough to have done such a thing, and for what specific purpose? She knew very little, only enough to confirm their worst fears about the traveling party. She hoped that in her absence, Calic had learned more. Calicos knew that with every second that ticked by, the focusing iris was moving farther and farther south, and it was becoming harder and harder to trace. He had an advantage, others in his flight did not. Though he was no longer the blue dragon aspect, he still led the blues. That tie to his flight, with echoes of what he had once been, seemed to enhance his connection to the iris. When Terralagos had said he could barely sense the object any longer, Calicos had closed his eyes and drawn in 3 deep breaths. He visualized it in his mind, concentrating on it, on sensing and there it was.
"It is now in the Borean tundra, is it not?" he asked Terralagos, with his eyes still closed. Yes, it is, and—"
The words ended in a harsh, short cry.
"It is gone." "No, it is not," Calic said. "I can still sense it."
Many dragons sighed in relief. At that moment, a female voice said quietly, "They were all slain, Calicos. All 5. He opened his eyes and regarded Kiragosa sickly as she recounted what she, Banagos, and Alagosa had beheld.
"And you cannot say if it was human or elf, orc or goblin?" he asked when she was done. "No scrap of a banner or distinctive arrow fletching?"
She shook her head. "What colors we found were random. There were no footprints. The snow had melted too much, and they were clever to both avoid the softer sand and refrain from tracking blood on the rocks. All we know, Calicos, is that someone likely knew where to find them, was strong enough to slay 5 dragons, and has absconded with the focusing iris. Whoever they were, they knew exactly what they were doing." Her voice was low on this final sentence. Calic nodded to her.
"Perhaps that is true, but so do we."
This was spoken with a certainty he did not feel.
"I am able to sense generally in which direction it travels, and I will follow it and bring it back."
"You are our leader, Calicos," said Kiragosa. "We need you here."
He shook his head.
"No, you do not," he said quietly. "It is because I am your leader that I must go. It is time we acknowledged what is happening, how the flight is feeling. Many of our people have already left for the wide world. We once knew the role we needed to play. Now we do not, and our most precious magical item, both tool and symbol, has been stolen, and good dragons lie dead for that theft. It is my job to guide and protect you. I have not done so."
It hurt to admit it.
"I have failed, at least in this, and perhaps in other things. You do not need me here to worry and wonder along with the rest of you, while others venture forth to retrieve our stolen orb. That is my task, and by performing it, I will indeed guide and protect you."
Glances were exchanged, but no one protested. They all knew this was the right path. He had meant everything he said. The failure was his. The recovery of the item was his duty. But what he did not say was that he wanted to go. He felt more at home interacting with the younger races than he did here, ostensibly leading his flight. He caught Kiri's eye, and she at least seemed to understand this deeper emotion, and approved of it.
"Kiragosa, daughter of Malagos," he said. "Take the wisdom of Terralagos and others, and be my voice here while I am gone."
"No one can truly be your voice, my friend," Kiragosa replied gently. "But I will do all I can. If anyone can find the lost focusing iris in this wide world of ours, it will be you, who among us all know Azeroth best." There was nothing more to say. In silence, Calicos leaped upward and flew out into the cold, snowy day, following the gentle tug that whispered, "This way, this way." Kirigosa had said she thought Calic knew Azeroth better than any other blue dragon. He could only hope she was right. Chapter 2. Bane Bloodhoof looked about uneasily as he and a small retinue entered the city of Orgrimmar. The sole progeny of the late, much beloved and mourned Tauren High Chieftain Cairn Bloodhoof, Bane had only recently stepped into the position his father had occupied for so many years. It was a responsibility he had never actively sought, and he had accepted the duty with both humility and regret at the time of his father's death. Since then, the world had changed in every respect. His personal world had shattered the night of his father's murder. Cairn had been slain in a Mak'gora, a ritual duel, by Garrosh Hellscream. Garrosh, who had recently been named war chief of the Horde by Thrall, had intended to fight honorably, but someone else did not wish him to. Magatha Grimtotem, a shaman who had long harbored a hatred of Cairn and a desire to lead the Tauren, had painted Garrosh's axe, Gorehowl, with poison rather than simple anointing oil. And so the noble Cairn had died by betrayal. Garrosh had stayed out of the ensuing conflict that arose when Magatha made a blatant bid for conquest of the Tauren. Bane had defeated the would-be usurper, banishing her, and those who refused to swear loyalty to him. Afterward, he had vowed his own loyalty to Garrosh in the orc's role as war chief, for a reason that was twofold, because his father would have wished it, and because Bane knew he had to do so in order to keep his people safe. Since then, Bane Bloodhoof had not come to Orgrimmar. He had no desire to. Now, he wished even more heartily that he could have stayed away. But Garrosh had sent a summons to all the leaders of the various Horde races, and Bane, having pledged his support to Grom Hellscream's son, had come. So had the others. To disobey would be to risk open war. Bane and his entourage rode their Kodos through the massive gates. More than one Tauren stared, ears flicking, at the towering scaffolding and the massive crane that moved above them. While Orgrimmar had never been as pastoral as Thunder Bluff, it was now actively martial. Looming iron construction, heavy and black and ominous, had replaced the simple wooden huts.
"To prevent another fire,"
Garrosh had said. And, Bane knew, to evoke the so-called glory days of the Horde. To remind everyone after the chaos of the Cataclysm and the subsequent terrorizing of Deathwing that the orcs, and by extension the Horde itself, were not to be trifled with. To Bane, the ugly changes did not represent strength. The new Orgrimmar represented domination, conquest, subjugation. Its hard, jagged metal was a threat, not a comfort. He did not feel safe here. He did not think anyone who was not an orc could feel safe here. Garrosh had even moved Grommash Hold from the Valley of Wisdom, where it had been under thrall since the founding of the city, to the Valley of Strength. A decision, Bane thought, that reflected the nature of each war chief. As the Tauren approached the hold, they were joined by a cluster of blood elves in their red and gold regalia. Lorthamar Theron, his long, pale blonde hair in a topknot, and his chin decorated with a small patch of beard, caught Bane's eye and nodded coolly. Bane returned the gesture.
"Friend Bane!"
called an unctuously cheerful voice. Bane looked over to his right, then down. A sly-looking, obese goblin with a slightly battered top hat chomped a cigar and waved boisterously at him.
"You must be Trade Prince Jaster Gallywix," Bane said.
That I am indeed," said the goblin with enthusiasm, giving him a toothy, somewhat predatory grin.
and delighted to be here today, as I'm sure you are. My first official visit to War Chief Garrosh's court." "I don't know that I'd call it a court," Bane said. Close enough, close enough. Delighted, yes. How are you all doing in Mulgore?"
Bane regarded the goblin. He did not dislike goblins on principle, as some did. Indeed, he owed a great debt to Gaslow, the goblin leader of the port town of Ratchet. Gaslow had been of tremendous help to Bane during Magatha's attack on Thunder Bluff, providing zeppelins, weaponry, and warriors of a sort for, by goblin standards, a paltry fee. Bane simply did not particularly care for this goblin. Nor, his sources told him, did anyone. Not even Gallywix's own people.
"We are rebuilding our capital and fighting back the Quillboar who are encroaching on our territory. The Alliance recently destroyed Camp Tarajo. We have erected the Great Gate so that they will come no farther," Bane said. "Oh, well, sorry, and congratulations, then," Gallywix laughed. "Good luck with all that, eh?" Thank you," Bane said.
Despite their small size, the goblins threaded their way through the flow of other horde races to be first to enter Grummish Hold. Bane flicked an ear, sighed, dismounted from his kodo, handed the reins over to a waiting orc, and entered the hold himself. This incarnation of the hold was, like everything else in the new Orgrimmar, more impersonal and martial, even the throne of the war chief of the horde. Under Thrall's leadership, the skull and armor of the demon Manaroth, whose blood had once corrupted the orcs and who was valiantly slain by Grom Hellscream, had been displayed on a massive tree trunk at the entrance to the hold. Garrosh had taken the symbols of his father's greatest victory and adorned his own throne with them, taking what Thrall had erected for the entire horde to see and making them instead a personal tribute. He even wore part of the demon's tusks as shoulder armor. Every time he saw Garrosh, Bane's ears flattened slightly at the affront.
"Bane," said a gruff voice.
Bane turned and felt the first surge of pleasure he had experienced since departing Thunder Bluff.
"Eitrig," he said warmly, embracing the elderly orc. It seemed this honorable old veteran was the last who remained here of Thrall's original advisors. Eitrig had served Thrall well and loyally, and had stayed behind at Thrall's request to advise Garrosh. It gave Bane hope that Garrosh had not concocted some reason to dismiss Eitrig. It had been Eitrig who had first noticed the smear of poison on Garrosh's weapon, Gorehowl, and who had told the young war chief that he had been tricked into slaying Cairn dishonorably. Bane had always respected Eitrig, but that deed in particular had made Bane the orc's steadfast friend. Bane narrowed his brown eyes at Eitrig's expression. Keeping his voice as soft as possible, not an easy task for a Tauren, he asked, "I take it you do not approve of the topic of today's gathering?"
Eitrig made a sour face.
"That is a pale statement, and I am not alone in my thoughts."
He clapped the young leader on his arm, then stepped back, indicating that Bane should proceed to his people's traditional place on the left of the war chief's throne. At least Garrosh had made no effort to demote the Tauren. Bane noted that Lorthamar was now on the right side of Garrosh, and next to the Blood Elves' sea of gold and red was the green skin of the goblins. Sylvanas and her Forsaken were directly opposite the orc, and Vol'jin and his trolls sat next to Bane. The orcs given the honor of being present, most of them Korkron, the formal guardians of the war chief, stood at attention, ringing the entire gathering. Bane recalled his father telling him of similar meetings in Orgrimmar. At those gatherings, there were feasts, laughter, and revelry, as well as debate and discussion. Bane saw no signs that anything resembling a feast had been prepared. Indeed, he thought, as he took a tepid swig from the waterskin that hung at his belt, it had been a good thing that he and his people had brought their own water. Otherwise, in this desert city that baked under the sun, the iron buildings absorbing the heat, the Tauren would even now be collapsing. The moments crawled by, and the gathered leaders and their companions began to grow restless. Low murmuring broke out among the Forsaken. It seemed to Bane that despite the undead's frequent chiding usage of the word, patience was not a universal discipline among them. His sharp, torn ears caught a sibilant whisper from Sylvanus, and the muttering subsided. An orc, clad in Corcron livery, stepped forward. One hand had only 3 fingers, and a livid scar, pale against the darker hue of his skin, zigzagged across his face and down his throat. Red war paint, looking like streaked blood, adorned face and arms. But it was not these distinctions that made Bane's eyes narrow at the newcomer. It was the tone of the orc's scarlet-decorated skin. Dark gray. That meant 2 things. One, that the orc was a member of the Blackrock clan, a clan that had birthed many infamous members. And 2, that he had spent years never seeing the light of day. He had dwelt inside Blackrock Mountain, serving Thrall's enemy. Names, imparted in dire tones by his father, Cairn, filled Bane's head. Black Hand the Destroyer, war chief of the Horde and secret member of the Shadow Council, who had offered Shaman up to become the first warlocks his people had ever known. That orc's son, Dalrend, nicknamed Rend, had skulked for years in the depths of Blackrock Spire and opposed Thrall's leadership. There had only been a handful of Blackrock orcs whom Thrall had spoken of with respect. A handful out of far too many. That this obviously seasoned veteran had the honor of opening the ceremonies, even ahead of the Corcron, made Bane uneasy about what was to come. The veteran gestured imperiously. Several green-skinned orcs stepped forward. They held long, ornately decorated chimera horns. With precise movements, they lifted the horns to their lips, filled their lungs, and blew. A long, deep, hollow sound reverberated through the chamber, and despite the current situation, Bane felt his spirit respond to the call to order. When the horns' blast had faded, the orcs who had blown them stepped back into the shadows. The Blackrock orc spoke. His voice was deep and gravelly, and it carried throughout the chamber.
Your leader, the mighty Garrosh Hellscream, approaches. Show him all honor.
The orc thumped his intact hand across his massive chest, turning to face the entrance to Grummish Hold. Garrosh's brown body was covered with tattoos. Even his lower jaw had been tattooed black. Bare-chested, the orc wore Manaroth's mammoth tusks, covered with spikes on his shoulders. His waist was encircled with a belt that bore a carved skull, evocative of that of the great demon that adorned the throne. He clutched Gorehowl, the legendary weapon of his father, and lifted it high. Shouting and cheers filled the huge chamber, and for a moment Garrosh stood, drinking it in. Then he lowered the axe and spoke.
I bid you all welcome,
he said, spreading his arms in an encompassing gesture.
You are true servants of the Horde. Your war chief calls you, and you come. Like trained wolves,
Bane thought, trying and failing to hide a frown. Thrall had never spoken so to his people. Garrosh continued.
Much has transpired since I assumed the mantle of war chief. We have faced trials and danger, threats to our world and our way of life, and yet we persevere. We are the Horde. We will not let anything break our spirits.
He lifted Gorehowl again, and in response the gathered orcs uttered a great cry. The rest of the Horde joined in, Bane included, for this was in support of the mighty Horde to which they all belonged. Garrosh spoke this much truth. Those who called themselves Horde would never let their spirits be beaten down, not by a shattered world, not by an insane former aspect, not by anything. Not even by a father's murder. Garrosh smiled around his tusks, nodding approvingly as he made his way to his throne, then raised his arms and called for silence.
You do not disappoint me, he said. You are the finest representatives of your races, the leaders, the generals, and that is why I called you here."
He settled himself in his throne, waving to indicate that the assembled crowd, too, could sit.
"There is a menace that has been present for too long, which we must now root out without mercy. A threat that has challenged us for years, to which we have, until recently, turned a blind eye in the mistaken notion that tolerance of a little shame will do no harm to the mighty horde. I have said, and say again, any shame is a great shame. Any injury is a great injury, and we will endure it no longer."
A chill crept over Bane. He thought of Eitrig's reaction to his earlier inquiry. Bane had half suspected what Garrosh wished to say when the order was given for the horde leaders to congregate. He had hoped he was wrong. The orc continued.
"We have a destiny to fulfill, and there is an obstacle to that destiny, one that we must crush beneath our feet like the insignificant insect it truly is. For far too long, nay, even a moment would be too long, the Alliance pests, not content with their stranglehold over the Eastern Kingdoms, have wormed their ways into our lands, our territory, into Kalimdor."
Bane closed his eyes briefly, pained.
"Chipping away at our resources and sullying the very earth with their presence. They are crippling us, preventing us from growing, from reaching the heights that I know we are capable of achieving. For I believe in my heart that it is not our fate to bow and scrape and sue for peace before the Alliance. It is our right to dominate and control this land of Kalimdor. It is ours, and we will claim it as such."
Garrosh's orcs roared in approval. Most of them, anyway. Those who stood with the Corcron and the Blackrock orc. Some murmured quietly to themselves. Many horde members followed the Corcron's example, some bellowing with the same enthusiasm, others, Bane noted, with far less gusto. Bane himself remained seated. A very few of his own Tauren applauded and stamped their hooves on the earth. The Tauren had not been untouched by the recent changes. The Alliance, expanding from Northwatch Hold under false information that the Tauren were planning an attack, had razed Camp Tarajo. The only residents it now had were looters. Many Tauren died in the battle. Others fled to Vendetta Point, where they sporadically attacked Northwatch Hold scouts, or to Camp Unafe, the camp of refuge. In response to the aggression, Bane did what he felt was best to keep his people safe. The road to Mulgore had once been open. Now, what had been dubbed the Great Gate shut out any possibility of a massive Alliance incursion. Most Tauren were content with the erection of the gate and did not burn for revenge. Others were still aching from the attack. He could not condemn these people. Bane did not rule with a tight grasp. The Tauren followed him willingly and with love, perhaps mostly out of respect for his father, but with openness in their hearts nonetheless. Those who disagreed with Bane's decisions, like many Grim Totem, or the Tauren who chose to strike back at the Alliance from Vendetta Point, were expelled from Thunderbluff, but otherwise suffered no repercussions. He returned his thoughts to the present as the cheering died down and Garrosh resumed.
"To that end, it is my intent to lead the Horde on a mission that will restore us to our rightful path."
He paused, looking over the sea of faces, drawing out the moment.
"Our first target will be Northwatch Hold. We will raze it, and once we have reclaimed that land as ours, we will move on to the next step. Theramore!"
Bane did not recall getting to his hooves, but suddenly he was standing. He was not alone. There was cheering, of course, but hard on its heels were cries of protest.
"War Chief! The Lady Jaina is too powerful," came a voice.
It sounded like a Forsaken.
"She has been passive and quiet. Rouse her and we will have war on our hands, a war we are not prepared to fight." She has behaved with fairness time and again, when she could have responded with force or deceit,
Bane shouted.
Her diplomatic efforts and her decision to work with War Chief Thrall have saved countless lives. To storm her realm with no provocation does not give honor to the Horde, and it is foolish besides.
There were many murmurs of agreement. Other alliance leaders were far less favored, and the Lady Jaina had those who respected her among the Horde. Bane was heartened to hear the murmurs, but Garrosh's next words plunged the Tauren back into despair.
First, Garrosh snapped, Thrall has given leadership of the Horde to me. Whatever he did or did not do means nothing now. I am the War Chief, to whom you have all sworn loyalty. My decisions are what matter. And those of you who condemn my plan do not even know what it entails. Be silent and listen.
The muttering died down, but not all of those who had risen took their seats.
You respond to this as if the conquest of Theramore were the goal. I tell you now, it is only the beginning. I do not speak solely of destroying the human foothold in Kalimdor. I speak also, and even more vigorously, of the Night Elves. Let them flee to the eastern kingdoms as we crush their cities and take their resources.
Drive them all out?
Said Vol'jin, baffled.
They've been here longer than we have, and we try something like that. The Alliance be over us like bees on the honey. You'd just be giving them the excuse they'd been looking for.
Garrosh turned slowly to the leader of the Darkspear Trolls. Inwardly, Bane winced. Vol'jin had been among the most outspoken of Garrosh's critics after the death of Cairn. There was little love lost between the Troll and Orc leaders. Garrosh had forced the Darkspears into Orgrimmar's slums. Outraged at the insult, Vol'jin had ordered the Trolls to leave Orgrimmar altogether. Now, the Darkspear leader came to the city only when summoned.
My soul is sick of the back and forth in Ashen Vale that has gone on nearly since we set foot in this world, growled Garrosh. Bane knew the Orc was still smarting from the latest defeat there at the hands of Varian Wrynn. And I am even more sickened by our own blindness to what we should and must do. The Night Elves claim compassion and wisdom, yet they murder us when we harvest a few trees that would provide life-giving shelter. The Night Elves have lived here long enough. Let them now linger only as a bad memory. It is the Horde's hour to reign on this continent, and reign we shall. This is why Theramore is key. Do you not understand?
Garrosh stared at the Horde members as if they were small children.
We crush Theramore. We stop the potential of Alliance reinforcements from the south. And then we give the Night Elves their due.
War Chief! The voice was female, at once both musical and cold. Sylvanas Windrunner, former High Elf Ranger General, and now the leader of the Forsaken, rose and gazed at Garrosh with intense, glowing eyes. The Alliance may indeed not send reinforcements, not at once, at least. They will turn and vent their wrath instead upon those of us in the Eastern Kingdoms, my people and the Sindori. She looked at Lor'themar almost imploringly. The Blood Elf leader's face remained impassive. Varian will march on my borders and destroy us. The comment was addressed to Garrosh, but she continued to stare at Lor'themar. Bane felt for her. She was hoping for support from one who might reasonably be expected to give it, and finding none.
War Chief, a word?
It was Eitrig, turning with the respect he owed to his leader.
I've heard from you already, my advisor, said Garrosh.
We have not,
Bane stated.
Eitrig was friend to my father and advisor to Thrall. He knows the Alliance in a way few do. Surely you do not object to the rest of us hearing what such a wise elder has to say.
The look that Garrosh shot Bane could have melted stone. The Tauren met the gaze with deceptive placidness. Nonetheless, the orc nodded to Eitrig.
"You may speak," he said curtly. "It is true that the Horde has done much to recover from the cataclysm," Eitrig began. "And it has been under your leadership, War Chief Garrosh. You are right. Yours is the title, yours are the decisions, but yours also is the responsibility. Think for a moment about the consequences of this choice. The Night Elves will be gone, the Alliance will be afraid to attack, and Kalimdor will belong to the Horde. Those will be the consequences, Elder."
Garrosh uttered the word, not with respect, but almost with contempt. Bane noticed that 2 or 3 orcs frowned at the war chief's tone of voice, and were listening intently to Eitrig. Eitrig shook his head.
"No," he said. "That is a hope. You hope to begin claiming this continent as ours. And you might. It would also begin a war that would involve armies from all over this world, Horde and Alliance, locked in a combat that would take lives and drain resources. Have we not suffered through enough of those costs?"
The orcs who had been paying close attention now started nodding. Bane recognized one of them as a shopkeeper here in Orgrimmar. Another, surprisingly, was one of the guards, though not a member of the elite Corcron.
"Costs!" said a slightly screechy voice. "I hadn't heard War Chief Garrosh mention costs, friend Eitrig."
It was, of course, Trade Prince Scallywix. He was standing, not that anyone could tell. The crown of his top hat was all that could be seen of him, but it bobbed up and down animatedly with his speech.
"What I hear is talk of profit for everyone. Why not expand, taking the resources of our enemies and driving them away at the same time? Even war is good business if you go about it properly."
Bane had had enough. The greedy, self-absorbed goblin's quip about the blood of heroes and foes alike being spilled for profit pushed Bane's anger past prudent silence.
"Garrosh," he said, "there is none here who can say that I do not love the Horde, nor any who can say that I do not honor your title."
Garrosh did not speak. He well knew that he had not come to Bane's aid when it was needed, and yet the Tauren still had acknowledged him as war chief. Bane had even saved Garrosh's life once. The orc made no attempt to silence Bane. Yet.
"I know this lady. You do not. She has worked tirelessly for peace, knowing well that we are not monsters, but people, like the people who compose the Alliance."
His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, and any rabble-rousers who might have been tempted to protest his labeling humans, night elves, dwarves, Draenei, Worgen, and gnomes as people wisely held their tongues.
"I have received aid and shelter in her home. She helped me when even members of the Horde would not. She does not deserve this treachery, this—"
"Bane, bloodhoof!"
snarled Garrosh, closing the distance between himself and the Tauren High Chieftain in a few strides. Bane towered over him, but Garrosh was not cowed.
"If you do not wish to share your father's fate, I would advise you to watch what you say." "You mean dying betrayed?"
Bane shot back. Garrosh roared. Archdruid Hamuel Runetotem stepped forward at the same time as Eitrig. But another interposed himself between Bane and Garrosh, the Blackrock orc. He did not touch Bane, but the Tauren could almost feel the fire of the other's banked rage churning. The gray-skinned orc's eyes glittered, their coldness not tempering the heat of his anger, but rather augmenting it. And Bane felt a prickle of unease. Who was this orc?
"Malkarok," said Garrosh. "Step down."
For what seemed an eternity, the Blackrock orc did not move. Bane had no desire for a confrontation, not here, not now. Attacking Garrosh, or this gray-skinned warrior who was clearly appointed specifically to defend him, would only further aggravate the young warchief and make him even more disinclined to listen to reason. At last, expelling air from his nostrils in a snort of contempt, Malkarok did as he was told. Garrosh moved forward, shoving his face up toward Bane's.
This is not a time for peace. The time for war has come. It is long overdue. Your own people have suffered from the expansion of the Alliance into your territory, unprovoked. If anyone should wish to destroy at the very least Northwatch Hold, it should be the Tauren. You say that Jaina Proudmoore assisted you once. Are your loyalties now to her and the Alliance, who have killed your people, or to the mighty Horde and me?
Bane took a long, slow breath and let it out through his nostrils. He bent his head to within an inch of Garrosh's and said, for that orc's ears only,
If I were ever to turn my back on the Horde and you, it would have been before this moment, Garrosh Hellscream. If you believe nothing else I say, believe that.
For a heartbeat, it seemed to Bane that an expression of shame crossed Garrosh's brown face. Then the scowl returned. Garrosh turned again to address the gathered crowd.
This is the will of your war chief, he said bluntly. This is the plan. First, Northwatch Hold, then Theramore. Then we drive the Night Elves before us and take for our own what was theirs. As for any Alliance protests, he said, sparing a brief glance for Sylvanas, rest assured they will be dealt with swiftly. I am grateful for your obedience in these matters, but I expected nothing less from the great Horde. Return now to your homes and prepare. You will hear from me again soon. For the Horde!
The cheer, uttered so often and always with such passion, filled the hold. Bane joined in, but his heart was not in it. Not only was Garrosh's plan dangerously reckless, which surely should have been enough to condemn it, but it was based on treachery and hatred. The Earth Mother could never give her blessing to such an endeavor. Garrosh waved Gorehowl above his head one final time, letting the weapon sing as the wind whistled through the holes in its blade, then lowered it. The Black Rock Orc, Malkrok, Garrosh had named him, right behind Garrosh before even Eitrig, before even the Korkron. The orcs encircling the gathering snapped to attention and followed their leader out of the hold. The crowd began to disperse. Bane saw the blue-skinned, red-haired troll leader moving toward him and slowed his own steps.
You baited him, said Vol'jin without preamble. I did. It was not wise.
No, it wasn't. That's why I stay quiet. Got to think about my people.
I understand.
The trolls were in more immediate peril from Garrosh's anger, living as close to Orgrimmar as they did. Bane did not blame Vol'jin. He glanced at the troll.
But I know what your heart is telling you.
Vol'jin sighed, looking somber, and nodded.
This a bad path we be walking down.
Tell me, do you know who this Malkrok is?
The troll scowled.
He be a Blackrock. They say he still don't like the light of Durota after being so long in Blackrock Mountain serving Rend.
I suspected as much, growled Bane.
He denounced his crimes in service to Rend and asked for amnesty. Garrosh be giving it to him, along with any others who swear to serve him with their lives. Now the war chief got a nice big dog with sharp teeth to protect him.
But how can he be trusted?
Vol'jin laughed a little.
Some might say, how can the Grim Totem be trusted? Yet you let the ones who swear loyalty stay at Thunder Bluff.
Bane thought of Tarakor, a black bull who'd served under Magatha. Tarakor had led the attack against Bane, but had pleaded for reprieve for himself and his family. Tarakor had proven to be as good as his word, as had all the others whom Bane had pardoned. And yet, somehow, to Bane, the Grim Totem seemed different from the Black Rocks.
Perhaps I am inclined to prejudge, said Bane. I think better of the Tauren than I do of orcs.
These days,
Vol'jin said quietly, making sure he was not overheard.
So do I.
Garrosh waited outside so that those who wished to take this opportunity to swear loyalty to him could do so more conveniently. A goblin female was kneeling before him, nattering on about something, when Malkorok said,
"There he is."
Garrosh looked up and spotted Lorthamar.
"Bring him."
He interrupted the goblin, patted her head, said,
"I accept your oath,"
and shooed her off as Malkorok approached with the Blood Elf leader. Lorthamar inclined his pale blonde head in a gesture of respect.
"You wish to see me, Warchief?"
"I do,"
said Garrosh, steering them off a few steps so that they might speak with more privacy. Malkorok ensured they would not be disturbed by stepping in front of them and folding his massive grey arms.
"Out of all the leaders, save Gallywix, who is supportive merely because he sees coins to be made, you are the only one who doesn't question your Warchief. Not even when Sylvanas tries to play upon your sympathy. I respect that, Elf. Know that your loyalty to me is duly noted." "The Horde embraced and supported my people when no one else would," Lorthamar replied. "I will not forget that. And so my loyalty and that of my people is to the Horde."
Unease stirred in Garrosh as he noticed a slight emphasis on Lorthamar's last word.
"I am the Horde's Warchief, Lorthamar, and as such, I am the Horde." "You are its Warchief," Lorthamar said, agreeing readily. "Is that all you wish of me? My people are anxious to return home and prepare for the war that is to come." "Of course," Garrosh said. "You may go."
Lorthamar had said nothing inflammatory, but the unease did not dissipate as Garrosh regarded the sea of red and gold move toward the gates of Orgrimmar.
"That one is worth watching," he said to Malkorok. "They're all worth watching," the Blackrock orc replied.
Chapter 3. "I recognize that dirty cloak," the image of Prince Anduin Wren said, grinning. Lady Jaina Proudmoore returned the smile. She and her nephew, firmly related by affection, if not blood, were conversing by means of an enchanted mirror Jaina kept carefully hidden behind a bookcase. When the proper spell was recited, the reflection of each respective room would vanish, and what had been a simple mirror would become instead a window. It was a variation on the spell that allowed magi to transport themselves and others from one site to another. Anduin had once shown up unexpectedly when Jaina was returning from one of her secret visits with then Warchief Thrall. Clever lad that he was, the prince had figured out what she'd been up to, and now they shared a secret. "Never could fool you," Jaina said. "How goes your time among the Draenei?" She could guess some of what he would tell her without waiting to hear the answer. Anduin had grown, not just physically. Even in the mirror, which rendered him in a palette of blues, she could see that his jaw was more determined and his eyes were calmer and wiser. "It's been truly amazing, Aunt Jaina," he said. "There is so much going on in the world that I want to be part of right now, but I know I have to stay here. I'm learning something new almost every single day. It kills me that I can't help, but it is the destiny of others to buy us a future for you to grow up in, Anduin," Jaina said. "It is your destiny to do precisely that, and do so well. Keep studying, keep learning. You're right, you are exactly where you need to be." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and suddenly looked very young again. "I know," he said, sighing. "I do know that. It's just hard sometimes." "There will come a time when you will long for these simpler, quieter days," Jaina said. Briefly, her mind went back to her own youth. Loved by her father and brother, safe with her governess and tutors, Jaina had been filled with the joy of learning and the duties of a young lady, despite the military nature of her family. She'd chafed against such things then, but now they seemed sweet and delicate as a flower's petals. Anduin rolled his eyes in mock exasperation. "Give Thrall my best," he said. "I'm sure that's hardly prudent," Jaina replied, but she smiled as she said it. She lifted the cloak's hood over her golden hair. "Be well, Anduin. It's good to hear how you are doing." "I will, Aunt Jaina. You be careful." His image vanished. Jaina, who had been tying the hood down tight, paused in mid-motion. You be careful. He was, indeed, growing up. As she had so many times before, she set out alone, taking care, as Anduin had asked, that she was not observed by anyone. She paddled the dinghy to the southwest, navigating the small islands of the area known as Tide Fury Cove. The occasional muckshell clacked at her in annoyance, but otherwise the waterways were undisturbed. Jaina pulled up to the meeting place, surprised to see that Thrall wasn't present. She felt slightly uneasy. So much had changed. He had given leadership of the Horde to Garrosh. The world had cracked open like an egg, never to be the same again. And a great evil that had burned with hate and madness had rampaged across Azeroth to, finally, be defeated. The wind shifted, caressing her face and blowing the hood off, despite the fact that she had tied it securely beneath her chin. Her cloak billowed back from her slender frame, and suddenly Jaina smiled. The wind was warm and smelled of apple blossoms, and before she quite realized what happened, it had lifted her out of the dinghy like a large, gentle hand. She did not struggle. She knew she was perfectly safe. Cradling her, the wind deposited her on the shore with the same care it had displayed when picking her up. Not a drop of muddy water had touched so much as the toe of her boot. He stepped out from his place of concealment behind a rock, and Jaina realized she still hadn't grown used to his new appearance. Instead of armor, Thrall, son of Durotan, wore simple robes. Red prayer beads encircled his throat. His large head, with black hair, was covered by a plain hood. The robes revealed part of his powerful green chest, and his arms were bare. He was indeed a shaman now, not a war chief. Only the doom hammer strapped to his back was familiar to her. He held out his hands, and Jaina took them.
"Lady Proudmoore," he said, his blue eyes warm with welcome. "Long has it been since we met so."
"Long indeed, Thrall," she said in agreement. "Perhaps too long."
"I am Goel,"
he said, reminding her gently. Slightly chagrined, she nodded. "My apologies. Goel it shall be." She looked around. "Where is Eitrig?"
"He is with the war chief,"
Goel said.
"While I now am leader of the Earthen Ring, I serve humbly. I do not think of myself as greater than any other member."
A hint of an amused smile quirked her mouth. "Many would consider you much more than a simple shaman," she said. "I among them. Or are the tales that you allied with 4 dragon aspects to help bring down Deathwing just stories?"
"It was an honor, and a humbling one, to so serve," Goel said.
Coming from anyone else, the words would have been simple politeness. Jaina knew them to be true.
"I merely held the space for the Earth Warder. It was all of us, working together, dragons and brave representatives of every race of this world. The credit for slaying the great monster goes to many."
Her eyes searched his. "You are content with all your decisions, then?"
"I am," he said. "If I had not left to join the Earthen Ring, I would not have been prepared to undertake the task that was asked of me."
She thought of Anduin and his training, which was taking him far away from family and loved ones. "There is so much going on in the world that I want to be part of right now, but I know I have to stay here. I'm learning something new almost every single day." And she had told him he was exactly where he needed to be. Now, Goel was saying the same thing. Part of her agreed with him. Surely the world was much better off without the ravages and terrorizing of Deathwing and the Twilight Cult. And yet... "Nothing is free, Goel," she said. "Your knowledge and skills were bought at a cost.
The orc you left behind in your place had done much harm in your absence. If I have heard about what is going on in Orgrimmar and Ashenvale, surely you must have." His mien, which had been deeply peaceful, now looked troubled.
"I have heard, of course."
"And you do nothing?"
"I have another path,"
Goel said.
"You've seen the results of that path. A threat that—"
"Goel, I hear this, but now that task is over. Garrosh is stirring up trouble between the Alliance and the Horde, trouble that didn't exist until he started it. I can understand if you don't wish to undermine him publicly, but perhaps you and I can work together. Form a summit of sorts. Ask Bane to join us. I know he has no love for what Garrosh is striving for. I could speak with Varian. As of late, he seems to be more reachable. Everyone respects you, even in the Alliance, Goel. You have earned that respect because of your actions. Garrosh has earned nothing but mistrust and hatred because of his." She indicated her cloak, which Goel had blown about with the wind he had sent to bear her to shore. "You can control the winds as a shaman, but the winds of war are blowing, and if we do not stop Garrosh now, many innocents will pay the price for our hesitation."
"I know what Garrosh has done," Goel said. "But I also know what the Alliance has done. There are innocents, yes, but even you cannot place the blame for the current tension squarely at Garrosh's feet. Not all the attacks have been initiated by the Horde. It does not seem to me that the Alliance is working particularly hard to find peace, either."
His voice was still calm, but held a warning note. Jaina winced, not at the tone of voice, but at the truth of what was said. "I know," she said heavily. She dropped down despondently on a rock, jutting up from the soil. "There are times when I feel as if my words fall on deaf ears. The only one who seems to be truly interested in forging a lasting peace is Anduin Wrynn, and he's just 14.
"That is not too young to care about his world."
"But it is too young to do anything about it," Jaina said. "It seems as if I am struggling through mud, simply to be heard, let alone actually listened to. It's difficult to try to be a diplomat and work for real, solid results, when the other side won't acknowledge reason anymore. I feel like a crow cawing in the field. I wonder if it's just wasted breath." She was surprised at the frankness and weariness in the words. Where had they come from? Jaina realized that she truly had no one to talk to express doubts to anymore. Anduin looked up to her as a role model, so she couldn't explain how disheartened she felt at times, and Varian and the other Alliance leaders were, most of them, firmly on the opposite side of any argument she made. Only Thrall, Goel, seemed to understand, and even he appeared at the moment to be denying how much his decision to appoint Garrosh as war chief of the Horde could cost. Jaina gazed down at her hands, the words pouring out of her, uncensored. "The world's changed so much, Goel. Everything's changed. Everyone's changed."
"Everyone and everything does change, Jaina," Goel said quietly. "It's the nature of things to grow, to become something they were not. The seed becomes the tree, the bud, the fruit, the—"
"I know that," Jaina snapped. "But you know what doesn't change? Hatred. Hatred and the hunger for power. People get an idea or a plan that works in their favor, and they dig in and won't let it go. They won't see what's right in front of them if it contradicts what they want. And the words of reason, of peace, just don't seem to be effective against that anymore." Goel raised an eyebrow.
"Perhaps you are right," he said noncommittally. "We must all choose our own paths. Maybe there is something else you should focus on."
She gave him a stunned look. "This world has already been torn apart. Do you truly think I should stop trying to prevent its inhabitants from tearing themselves apart?" Jaina stopped just short of adding, "like you have done." It wasn't fair. Goel had hardly been idle. He had indeed been doing much for Azeroth, but still, it was petty of her, but she felt as if he had let her down.
She folded her stained cloak about her frame in what she realized was a defensive gesture. Sighing, she deliberately loosened her tight shoulders. Goel sat quietly beside her on the boulder.
"You must do what you think is best, Jaina," he said.
A slight wind stirred the braids in his beard. He looked off into the distance as he spoke.
"I cannot tell you what that is, or else I would be just like these others whom you find so frustrating."
He was right. There had been a time when Jaina had easily discerned what the best thing to do was in a given situation, even if it was bitterly hard to do it. Choosing not to stand with her own father as he fought the Horde had been such a defining moment for her. So had been walking away from Arthas when he instigated what became known later as the culling of Stratham. But now, it's all so uncertain, Goel. More than it ever has been, I think. He nodded.
"It is indeed."
She turned to look at him searchingly. He had changed in more ways than one. Not just his clothing, or his name, or his demeanor, but... "So," she said, "the last time we met, it was to celebrate a happy occasion. How is life with Agra treating you?" His blue eyes warmed.
"Well, indeed," he said. "She honors me by accepting me."
"I think you honor her," Jaina said. "Tell me about her. I didn't really have much of a chance to talk to her." Goel gave her a speculative glance, as though wondering why she wished to know, then shrugged slightly.
"She is, of course, a Mughar, born and raised in Draenor. That is why her skin is brown. She and her people were never tainted by any sort of exposure to demon blood. Azeroth is new to her, but she loves it passionately. She is a shaman, like me, and devotes herself entirely to healing this world. And," he added quietly, "healing me."
"Did you need healing?" Jaina asked.
"We all do, whether we see it or not," Goel replied. "We bear the wounds of simply living in this life, even if we never have a physical scar. A mate who can see one for who one is, truly and completely. That is a gift, Jaina Proudmoore. A gift that restores and renews one daily, and which must be tended carefully. It is a gift that has made me whole, made me understand my purpose and place in the world."
Gently, he laid a large green hand on her shoulder.
"I would wish such a gift and such insights for you, my dear friend. I would see you happy, your life complete, your purpose clear."
"My life is complete, and I know my purpose." He smiled around his tusks.
"As I said, only you know what is right for you. But I will say this with certainty. Whatever journey you are on, whatever your path may lead to, I, at least, have found it to be sweeter by far with a life companion at my side."
Jaina thought with a trace of uncharacteristic bitterness of Kael'thas Sunstrider and Arthas Menethil. Both had once been so bright and beautiful. Both had loved her. One she had respected and admired. The other she had loved deeply in return. Both had fallen to the call of dark powers and the weaker parts of their natures. She smiled without humor. "I do not think I'm very wise at choosing life companions," she said. She forced down the frustration and unhappiness and uncertainty and reached to place her small, pale hand on his. "I'm better when it comes to friends." They sat together for a long, long time. Chapter 4. It began to rain as Jaina paddled back to Theramore after her meeting with Thrall. Though it made her cold and uncomfortable for the moment, she welcomed the inconvenience, as few tended to venture out in such inclement weather. She tied up the little dinghy to the dock, slipping a little on the wet wood, and under cover of the steady downpour made her way to the magically concealed secret entrance to the tower, unnoticed. Shortly, she was in her cozy parlor. Shivering, Jaina lit the fire with a murmured incantation and a flick of a finger, dried her clothes the same way, and put away the cloak. She brewed some tea and selected a few cookies, set them down on a small table, and settled in by the fire, thinking about what Thrall had said. He seemed so content, calm. But how could he be? In a very real sense, he had turned his back on his people and, in handing the reins to Garrosh, had practically guaranteed that war would become inevitable. If only Anduin were older, he would be a valuable ally. But youth was so fleeting, Jaina felt guilty for momentarily wishing Anduin would miss a single day of it. And Thrall, go well. It would take her some time to get used to the new name. Was married now. What would this mean for the Horde? Might he want his son or daughter to rule after him? Would he take up the mantle of the Horde again, if this Agra gave him a child?
"Save any cookies for me, lady?"
The voice was female, youthful, a little squeaky. Jaina smiled without turning around. She'd been so engrossed in her thoughts, she hadn't heard the distinctive humming sound of a teleportation spell. "Kindy, you can always make your own." Her apprentice laughed cheerfully, hopping into a chair opposite Jaina beside the blazing fire and reaching for a cup of tea and one of the aforementioned cookies.
"But mine are only apprentice cookies. Yours are master cookies. They're ever so much better."
"You'll figure out chocolate bits any day now," Jaina said, keeping her face deadpan. "Though your apple bars are coming along quite nicely."
"I'm glad you think so,"
said Kindy Sparkshine. She was perky, even for a gnome, with a shock of bright pink hair pulled back in pigtails that made her look much younger than her 22 years, just a teenager by her people's reckoning of age. It would be easy to dismiss her as a chipper little thing with as much substance as the spun candy confection her hair resembled. But those who looked into her wide blue eyes would see a sharp intelligence there that contradicted the innocent face. Jaina had taken her on as an apprentice several months ago. She hadn't really had much of a choice. Ronan, who had led the Kirin tour through the Nexus War, and still guided them, had requested Jaina's presence shortly after the cataclysm had struck. He was more somber than she'd ever seen him as he met her in the purple parlor, a special place, accessible, as far as she knew, only by portal. After pouring them each a drink of sparkling Dalaran wine, he sat beside her and regarded her intently. "Ronan," Jaina had asked quietly, not even taking a sip of the delicious beverage. "What is it? What has happened?"
"Well, let's see," he replied. "Deathwing is loose. Darkshore has fallen into the sea."
"I mean with you." He smiled faintly at his own dark humor.
"Nothing is wrong with me, Jaina. Merely, well, I have a concern that I'd like to share with you."
She frowned, a small crease appearing between her brows, and put the glass down. "Me? Why me? I'm not one of the Council of Six. I'm not even a member of the Kirin Tor anymore." Once she had been, working closely with her master, Antonidas. But after the Third War, when the scattered members of the Kirin Tor had reformed, it hadn't felt the same to her.
"And this is precisely why it's you I must speak with," he said. "Jaina, we've all endured so much. We've been so busy, well, fighting and planning and doing battle, that we've fallen behind on another, perhaps even more important duty."
Jaina gave him a bemused smile. "Defeating Malagus and recovering from a world shaken like a rat in a mastiff's mouth seem pretty important to me." He nodded.
"They are, but so is training the next generation."
"What's that got to do?" "Oh." She shook her golden head firmly. "Ronan, I'd like to help, but I can't come to Dalaran. I have my own challenges in Theramore, and even though Horde and Alliance have been equally harmed by the Cataclysm, we still have so much—" He held up an interrupting hand.
You misunderstand me, he said. I'm not asking you to stay here in the Violet Citadel. There are enough of us here, but too few out there in the world.
Oh, she said again. You want me to take an apprentice?
We do, if you're amenable. There is one young woman in particular I'd like you to consider. She's extremely promising, intelligent, and fiercely curious about the world outside her limited view of Ironforge and Dalaran. I think you'd be a very good match.
And then Jaina understood. She reclined in the comfortable purple cushions and reached for the wine. She took a small sip and said, And someone who'd do a fine job of reporting back to you, too, I presume.
Come now, Lady Proudmoore. You can't expect us to leave so powerful and influential a mage all alone out there in Theramore.
Honestly, I'm surprised you haven't sent along an observer before, she said. He gave her a rueful look.
There's so much in chaos now, he said. It's not that we don't trust you. It's that we simply need to, well...
I promise not to open any dark portals, Jaina said, lifting her hand and mockingly swearing. That made him laugh. Then he sobered. Placing a hand on hers, he leaned in for a moment.
You do understand, don't you?
I do, Jaina said. And she did. Before, there'd been no time for anything other than simple survival. Any mage, anywhere, who had not actively allied with Malygos had been a threat to him. Now, with the world splintered, old alliances were splintered as well. And Jaina was both a powerful mage and a respected diplomat. Thoughts of Antonidas, who had, after much badgering on her part, taken her on as an apprentice what seemed like ages ago, filled her mind. He had been a wise and good man, with a strong sense of right and wrong, and the willingness to die to protect others. He had inspired and shaped her. Suddenly, Jaina very much wanted to give back to the world what it had given her. She was quite aware that she was a mage of no small ability, and now that the subject had been broached, she thought it might be a good thing to teach someone what she knew. She did not have to rejoin the Kirin Tor to help others understand and work well with magic, as she'd learned how to do. Life was unpredictable, these days more so than ever. Additionally, she found she missed Anduin's occasional presence. Perhaps a young person would liven up the damp old place. You know, she said, I recall a certain headstrong young woman who pestered Antonidas to take her as an apprentice.
And as I recall, she turned out rather well. Some say she's the finest mage in Azeroth.
Some say many things.
Please tell me you'll teach her, Ronan said,
dropping any hint of anything other than complete sincerity. I think it's a fine idea, she said firmly.
You'll like her,
Ronan said. His expression grew impish.
She'll challenge you.
Kindy had challenged Pained, too, Jaina remembered. She smothered a smile as she thought about Payne's reaction to the gnome girl. Pained was a night elf, a warrior who had stayed with Jaina ever since being assigned to the mage at the Battle of Mount Hyjal. She steadfastly served as Jaina's bodyguard, whether or not the lady actually needed her, unless Jaina sent her off on a more covert mission. Jaina often told Pained that she was free to return to her people at any point. Pained usually shrugged and said, Lady Tyrande never officially relieved me of my duty, and would not reply further. Jaina didn't quite understand the night elf's stubbornness and inexplicable devotion, but she was grateful for it. At one point, Kindy had been studying, while Jaina methodically went through her cabinet of reagents, writing up new labels for those that were almost illegible, and putting aside items that had lost their potency for proper disposal. Chairs in Theramore were designed for humans, and Kindy's feet didn't reach the floor. She had been swinging them absently, sipping tea as she perused a tome nearly as large as she was. Pained had been busying herself, cleaning her sword. Out of the corner of her eye, Jaina had noticed the elf glancing at Kindy now and then, looking more annoyed each time. Finally, pain burst out.
Kindy, do you enjoy being perky?
Kindy closed the book, marking her place with a small finger, and pondered the question. After a moment, she said, "People don't take me seriously. This often denies me opportunities to be useful. I find it rather frustrating. So, no, I don't enjoy being perky."
Pain nodded. "Ah, that is all right then," she said, and returned to her work. Jaina had to excuse herself quickly in order to keep from laughing. Unintentional perkiness aside, Kindy had indeed challenged Jaina. The gnome had more energy than anyone Jaina had ever met. The questions were endless. At first, they were amusing, then annoying, and then Jaina woke up one day and realized she was truly a mentor. A master with an apprentice who would grow up to do her proud. Ronan hadn't been exaggerating. He had probably given her the best the Kirin Tor had to offer. Kindy was curious about Jaina's role as a leader, as well as a mage. Jaina would have liked to have told the gnome about the secret meetings with Goel. Kindy seemed the type of person who might understand Jaina's reasoning, but of course could not. Fond of the girl though Jaina might be, Kindy was, in the end, honor-bound to report everything she knew to the Kirin Tor. Jaina's slip with Anduin had taught her to take extra precautions, and thus far she was certain that Kindy was still ignorant of the meetings. "How is Master Ronan?" Jaina inquired.
"Oh, he is well. He sends his best," Kindy replied. "He seemed a bit distracted," she mused, pausing to take another bite of cookie.
"We're magi, Kindy," Jaina said wryly. "We're always distracted by something or other."
"This is true," she said cheerily, brushing at some crumbs. "But even so, my visit seemed rather rushed."
"Did you get to spend time with your parents?" Kindy's father, Windle, was entrusted with the important duty of lighting all of Dalaran's streetlights with his wand in the evening. According to Kindy, he so enjoyed the task that he sold wands that enabled others to experience it themselves a time or two. Her mother, Jaxie, often provided baked goods for the high elf Amy to sell at her stall, and the gnome's red velvet cupcakes were extremely popular. This heritage was part of the reason that Kindy was so frustrated at her own, in her opinion, subpar pastries.
"I did."
"And yet you still want cookies," Jaina teased.
Kindy shrugged. "What can I say? Every tooth I have is a sweet tooth," she replied, with the cheerful attitude that Jaina had come to expect, but it was clear something continued to worry the gnome. Jaina placed her plate down on the table.
"Kindy, I know that you were supposed to report back to the Kirin Tor. That was part of the agreement. But you're also my apprentice. If you have any problems with me as your master..."
The blue eyes widened. "You? Oh, Lady Jaina, it's not you at all. It's just, I felt that something was off in Dalaran. You could sense it in the air. And Master Ronan's behavior didn't help put me at ease."
Jaina was impressed. Not all magi developed the sixth sense that told them, as Kindy had put it, that there was something off. Jaina herself had the ability, to a degree. She couldn't always tell when things were magically amiss, but when she did get that feeling, she paid attention to it. And Kindy was only 22. Jaina smiled a bit wistfully. "Master Ronan was right about you," she said. "He said you were gifted." Kindy blushed just a little. "Well, I'm sure if there is something truly amiss, we'll hear about it soon enough," Jaina said. "In the meantime, did you finish the book I sent along with you?" Kindy sighed.
"An in-depth analysis of the temporal effects of conjuration of foodstuffs?"
"That would be the one, yes."
"I did, although..."
She hesitated and wouldn't meet Jaina's eyes. "What's wrong?"
"Well, I think there's now a smudge of frosting on page 43.
Night fell in Orgrimmar. The heat dwindled, but did not dissipate.
The hard-baked sand, devoid of vegetation, held the sun's heat, as did the large, newly constructed metal buildings. Orgrimmar, like all of Durotar, was hardly a pleasant place from a climate standpoint. It never had been, and now it was even less so. That suited Malkorok just fine. He found the heat of Durotar uncomfortable, as he had found the heat of the interior of Black Rock Mountain, and that was good. The best thing that had ever happened to the Orc people was leaving the softness of places like Nagrand back in their home world of Draenor. This was a place that tested one's mettle, that tempered and tried one. It was not good to become too comfortable, and part of Malkorok's job was to see to it that no orc grew too comfortable. Some orcs at the recent gathering had been too comfortable, too secure in the rightness of their opinions. They'd openly voiced displeasure and disagreement with one who was not just their war chief, but the leader of their own kind, the leader of the orcs. The very arrogance of it caused Malkorok to grit his teeth in anger. He forced himself to stay silent as he moved quietly through the streets. He had told Garrosh that they were all worth watching. Garrosh had initially assumed Malkorok meant that all the leaders of the various races composing the Horde should be observed. The Black Rock Orc had a much, much larger view. When he said they were all worth watching, he meant the entire Horde. Every member of the Horde. And so it was that he'd had some of his best orcs follow a few of the malcontents who had dared to stay silent while others cheered. Of course, Eitrig, well loved and respected, an advisor Garrosh had promised Thrall he would listen to, could speak with impunity. For the moment. But others who had sided with the old orc must pay the price of what Malkorok and Garrosh considered nothing less than open, unabashed treason. His mind went back to several years ago when he had served Rend Blackhand. He thought with satisfaction of what had happened to those adventurers, unwise enough to enter into the heart of the mountain and challenge Rend. But even more vividly, he recalled what he himself had done to his fellow orcs who had muttered against Blackhand, thinking themselves safe in the shadows. He had stalked them, carrying out his own implacable justice. Rend had commented once when one of the traders had gone missing. Malkorok had simply shrugged, and Rend had given him a sneering grin of approval. It was never mentioned after that. Things were different now, but not that much different. Now Malkorok did not walk in the shadows alone. 4 Corcoran, appointed specifically by Garrosh to obey Malkorok's orders, as if they were his own, accompanied him, moving as stealthily as if they were shadows themselves. Corgus lived in the Cleft of Shadow, one of the more unsavory parts of Orgrimmar. One might assume that, with such a residence, Corgus was involved in shady business. However, the name of his shop, Dark Earth, was nothing more sinister than a description of the soil needed for his crop, mushrooms. While Corgus was, as far as Malkorok knew, a law-abiding citizen, the fact that he lived here made the Black Rock Orcs' duty easier. With a wink and a few gold coins, would-be witnesses nodded and looked away. Corgus was kneeling, using a sharp knife to harvest mushrooms for sale on the morrow. He cut swiftly, close to the base of the fungus, tossed it in a sack, and moved on to the next. His back was to the door, which had a curtain partly drawn over the entrance and a sign that read, "Closed." Though he could not see his visitors, he sensed their presence and stiffened. Slowly he rose and turned around, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Malkorok and his companions standing at the entrance.
"Read the sign," he grunted. "The shop doesn't open until tomorrow."
Malkorok noticed with amusement that the mushroom farmer tightened his grip on his small blade, as if that would help.
"We're not here for mushrooms,"
Malkorok said, his voice soft. He and the other 4 orcs moved into the shop. One of them closed the curtain.
"We're here for you."
Chapter 5. Dawn's light, gentle but persistent, found its way through the cracks in the curtains of Jaina's bedchamber. Used to awakening at this hour, she blinked, smiled sleepily, and stretched. She swung her legs out over the bed, rose, threw on a robe, and pulled back the dark blue curtains. It was a gorgeous morning, rose and gold and lavender, where the sun hadn't yet chased away the shadows of night. She opened the window and breathed deeply of the salty air, letting it tousle her bed-rumpled golden hair still further. The sea, always the sea. She was the daughter of the Lord Admiral, and her brother had once quipped that the Proudmoores all had seawater in their veins. A hint of melancholy touched her as she thought of her father and brother. She lingered for a moment longer, remembering, then turned from the window. Jaina brushed her hair, then sat down in front of a small table. With a thought, she lit a candle and gazed at the flickering flame. She started every day thus, if she could manage it. It helped her focus and prepare for whatever might be thrown her. Her blue eyes widened, and she became instantly alert. Something was about to happen. She recalled talking to Kindy last evening. The gnome was no doubt still asleep. She could have been born a night elf, she liked to stay up late so much. About her visit to Dalaran and subsequent unease.
"It's just, I felt that something was off in Dalaran," Kindy had said. "You could sense it in the air."
Jaina was sensing something now, like an old sailor who could feel a storm approaching in her bones. She felt a vague fluttering of apprehension in her chest. Her morning ritual would have to wait. Quickly, she bathed and dressed, and so it was that she was already downstairs and making tea when one of her most trusted advisers, Archmage Turvosh, knocked on the door. Unlike Kindy, he didn't have anything officially to do with the Kirin tour. He was, like Jaina, more comfortable on his own, and the two had developed a great and rewarding friendship, living in Proudmoore as a couple of mavericks.
"Lady Jaina," he said. Well, there is someone here to see you."
He looked unhappy.
"He won't give me his name, but he bears a letter of safe passage from Ronan. I checked. It's genuine."
He handed her the rolled-up scroll, sealed with the familiar eye symbol of the Kirin tour. Breaking the seal and reading, Jaina instantly recognized Ronan's handwriting.
"Dear Lady Jaina, I ask that you give this visitor whatever aid he requires. His cause is frighteningly real, and he needs all the assistance those of us who practice magic can offer him."
Jaina inhaled quickly. What was going on that Ronan would say something like this? "Show him in," she said. Looking as disturbed as Jaina felt, Turvosh nodded and withdrew. While she waited, Jaina poured herself a cup of tea and sipped on it, pondering. A moment later, a man with a hood pulled low over his head strode into her parlor. He wore simple traveling clothes that yet bore no stain of traveling such a great distance. A blue cloak made from rich fabric swirled about him as he moved with a lithe quickness. He bowed and straightened.
"Lady Jaina,"
he said in a pleasant voice.
"I apologize for coming so early and unheralded. It's not the way I would have wished to arrive."
With that, he pushed back the hood that had hidden his face and gave her an uneasy smile. He had the best of both human and elven features, blue-black hair that fell to his shoulders, and blue eyes bright with purpose. She recognized him at once. Her eyes grew wide, and her teacup crashed to the floor.
"Oh, that's my fault,"
Caligos, former aspect of the blue dragonflight, said. He waved a hand. The spilled tea disappeared, and the teacup reassembled itself, reappearing empty in Jaina's hand. "Thank you," Jaina managed to say. She gave him a slightly lopsided smile. "You've also taken away the chance for me to welcome you in a proper manner. At least I can offer you some tea." He returned her smile, but it didn't reach his eyes.
"I would welcome some, thank you. And I regret that we don't have time for the formalities and pleasantries. It's nice to see you again, even under these circumstances."
Jaina poured tea for them both with a hand that didn't tremble. She'd recovered almost at once. She had seen Kalagos at the bonding ceremony of Goel and Agra, and had liked him immediately, although there had not been time for much conversation. She handed him a cup and said sincerely, "Lord Kalagos of the Blue Dragonflight, I know well of your noble deeds and good heart. You are welcome in Proudmoore. The letter you presented instructs me to offer all aid I can, and that is what you shall have." She sat down on the small couch and indicated that he join her. To her surprise, this being, so powerful and ancient, seemed almost shy as he accepted the tea.
"It is an honor for me to work with you as well, lady," he said. "You have a reputation also, one that I have long admired. Your understanding of magic and the solemnity with which you wield that power, as well as the more, shall we say, mundane powers of diplomacy and leadership, are to be respected."
"Oh," Jaina said. "Well, thank you. But pleasant as it is, I don't think you came all the way from North Rend to compliment and be complimented." He sighed and took a sip of the tea.
"Unfortunately, you are correct. Lady—"
"Jaina, please. I don't stand much on ceremony in my home."
"Jaina."
He lifted blue eyes to her that no longer held any hint of lightness.
"We're in trouble, all of us."
"Your flight?"
"No, not just my people. Everyone in Azeroth."
My, that's a tall tale.
Kindy stood in the doorway, looking both confused and wary.
Or at least exaggerated. Surely not every single person in Azeroth will be affected by whatever trouble the Blue Dragonflight has gotten itself into now.
Her hair was a mess. Jaina suspected she'd put it up in pigtails quickly, without even running a brush through it. Kalagos seemed more amused than upset by the gnome's sharp tongue, and he turned to Jaina quizzically. Jaina recalled Kindy's statement to Pained that no one took her seriously. She felt sure that Kalagos would learn to. "Kalagos, may I present Kindy Sparkshine, my apprentice?"
"How'd you do?"
said Kindy, helping herself to some tea.
"I heard you talking outside to Archmage Turvosh. I got curious."
"A pleasure to meet you, Apprentice Sparkshine. I'm sure that anyone Jaina chooses to take under her wing is a worthy student."
Kindy sniffed and sipped tea.
"You'll forgive me, sir," she said. "Given all that's recently happened, I and the rest of the Dalaran Magi are a bit leery of your flight. I mean, you know, war and attempted slaughter of all other Magi? Things like that."
Jaina winced inwardly. A 22-year-old apprentice was all but accusing the former Blue Dragon aspect of, at the very least, bearing the responsibility for previous aspect's actions, and at the most, being deceitful himself. "Kindy, Kalagos is a dragon of peace. He's not like Malygos. Kalag lifted a hand, politely interrupting her.
"That's quite all right. No one knows better than I what my people have done to others who use arcane magic in this world. I've come to expect Kindy's attitude from anyone who isn't a blue dragon."
He gave the gnome a small smile.
"A rather large part of my task as the flight's leader, if no longer its aspect, has been to try to show that not all of us approved of the Nexus War, and that since the death of Malygos, we've not attempted to control or manipulate others who use the arcane."
"Isn't that the flight's job, though?" asked Kindy. "Wasn't the aspect entrusted with that very duty? And don't you still kind of perform that role, even if your unique abilities are gone?"
Kalagos's eyes took on a faraway look. When he spoke, his voice was both softer and deeper, though it remained his own.
"Magic must be regulated, managed, and controlled, but it must also be appreciated and valued, and not hoarded. Such is the contradiction you must deal with."
Jaina felt a shiver run along her spine. Even Kindy looked subdued. Kalagos's eyes once again became bright and alert, and he regarded both of them.
"These were the words once spoken by Norgannon, the Titan who gave Malygos the power of an aspect."
"And so you make my point for me," Kindy said.
Understanding now that Calicos would not take umbrage, and thinking that it might be wise for her to hold her tongue and let the two of them hash it out, Jaina leaned back against the couch's cushion and simply observed.
"All words are subject to interpretation," said Calicos. "Malygos chose to understand that he was the ultimate minder of magic. Because he disapproved of how others were choosing to manage magic, he decided to recover it all for himself and his flight alone, that only they could appreciate and value it. I choose to regulate, manage, and control my own magic, to lead by example, to encourage others to appreciate and value it. Because, Kindi, if you truly appreciate and value something, then you wish to manage it well. You don't want to hoard it, you want to share it. And that was how I chose to be the minder of magic in this world. Now I am merely the flight's leader. I'm no longer an aspect. And in this new role, believe me, I more than welcome aid from the Kirin Tor and anyone else who is willing to help."
Kindi pondered this, one foot swinging as it dangled off the floor. The gnomish culture was nothing if not logical, and Kindi's methodical brain could appreciate what Calic was saying. Finally, she nodded.
"Tell us about this thing that's going to affect everyone in Azeroth," she said.
Kindi wasn't going to apologize for her attitude, but she clearly had moved past mistrust of the Blue Dragon leader. Calic, too, seemed to understand the shift, and addressed both women in his response.
"You are familiar with the device known as the Focusing Iris, which has long been in the keeping of the Blue Dragonflight."
"That's what Malygos used to create the surge needles that diverted the magical ley lines of Azeroth, so they flowed to the Nexus," said Kindi.
Jaina was afraid she was starting to put two and two together, but even now, she still hoped she was wrong.
"Yes," he said, "it was. And it is this ancient orb that has been stolen from us."
Kindi looked as if she was going to be sick. Jaina stared at Calicos in horror. She couldn't imagine how he felt. She blurted out the first thing that came to her mind.
"Thank you for being willing to ask for help,"
she said, reaching out and pressing his hand impulsively. He glanced at her hand, then her face, and nodded.
"I did not exaggerate when I said it affects all of us," he said. "I spoke with Ronan, then flew directly here. You, young lady," he said to Kindi, "are only the third non-dragon to know."
I'm flattered," stammered Kindi.
The resentment she seemed to bear toward Calic had utterly disappeared. She said nothing more about tall tales. Calicos had been telling the truth.
"What do you know of the theft?"
asked Jaina, anxious to turn the discussion to practical matters. What was known, what was yet to be discovered, and, hopefully, what could be done about it. Briefly, Calicos filled them in. Jaina's heart sank with each word. Taken by unknown foes, who could overcome 5 dragons?
"Did Ronan offer any help?"
she asked, surprised by how faint and hopeless her own voice sounded. Kindi was turning the color of parchment and hadn't spoken in a while. Calicos shook his blue-black head.
"No, not yet, at any rate. I was able to sense the direction in which it was traveling. Faintly, but it was there. That's what led me to Kalimdor, and to you, Jaina."
He spread his hands in an imploring gesture.
"I am the leader of the Blue Dragons. We understand magic. We have our own tomes, more ancient than any you have seen. But what we do not have are your resources. I'm not arrogant enough to think that we know everything. There are magi not born dragons who came up with things no dragon ever knew of. That's where you can help me, if you would."
"Of course,"
said Jaina.
"I'll bring in Archmage Turvosh and we'll all put our heads together."
"Breakfast first?" asked Kindi.
"Absolutely," Calicos said. "Who can focus on an empty stomach?"
Slowly, Jaina's heart lifted, at least a little. Calic could track the progress of the missing device. He was willing, apparently eager, to accept help. And he was right. Who could focus on an empty stomach? Their eyes met, and he smiled. Her heart lifted a little more. They had to believe they would recover it in time. And as Calicos, Kindy and she went into the dining room, she had hope that they would. The five of them, Jaina, Calicos, Turvosh, Pained, and Kindy, flung themselves into work and research. Kindy returned to Dalaran, where, with Ronan's blessing, she had access to the library. Jaina envied her the task. "I remember when that was my duty," she told Kindy, giving the gnome a quick hug. "There was nothing I liked better than poring through those old tomes and scrolls and simply learning." She felt a slight pang. The new Dalaran was beautiful, but she no longer belonged there.
"It was probably more fun when the fate of the world didn't rest on your research,"
Kindy said morosely. Jaina had to agree. Pained, who was in charge of Jaina's spy network, departed when she heard the news.
"I will go into the field and learn what I can," she said. "My spies are diligent, but they might not understand what they need to look for in this situation."
She eyed Calicos.
"I assume you may be safe here with this person, my lady."
"I think my own skills and those of a former aspect will keep me safe in the event of any threat." "Yes, Pained," Jaina said. Her voice held no amusement, as she knew how seriously Pained took her duties. The night elf's gaze flickered to Calic, then back to Jaina. Pained saluted.
"Lady."
Once Kindy and Pained had departed for their respective errands, Jaina looked at Turvosh and Calicos, nodded briskly, and said, "Let's get to work. Calic, earlier you said that you were able to track the focusing iris. Why haven't you simply followed it? Why come to me?" He glanced down, looking slightly sick.
"I said I had been able to follow it. The trail vanished shortly after I reached Kalimdor." "What?"
Turvosh was irritated.
"It couldn't just stop."
"Yes," Jaina said, her voice heavy. "It could. Whoever stole this thing must have a great deal of power at their disposal if they could stand against 5 dragons. But they didn't know enough about it at that time to completely conceal the theft. That's why Calic was able to track it."
"My thoughts exactly," Calic said. "At some point, they either did learn enough about it or found a mage who was sufficiently powerful to hide its emanation from me."
Turvosh put his face in his hands for a moment.
"That's someone very powerful indeed."
"True," Jaina said. She lifted her chin in slight defiance of the bad news. "They may have a powerful mage, or more than one, but so do we, and we have the benefit of someone who knows everything about the focusing iris. We'd better settle in for a bit while Calic brings us up to speed."
"What do you need to know?"
"Everything," she said firmly. "Don't just give us the basics. We need all the details. Even something that seems insignificant could prove useful. Turvosh and I must know what you know." Calicos smiled ruefully.
"That could take some time."
It did. He talked until it was time for the midday meal, when they paused briefly to eat, and then until dinner, and continued after that. Even a dragon's voice, it seemed, became hoarse if he spoke too long. The hour grew late, and that first night the three all stumbled off to their various bedchambers with heavy-lidded eyes. Jaina didn't know how the others slept, but as for herself, she had nightmares. She awoke the next morning, feeling groggy and unrested. Her ritual did not restore her as it usually did, and the sky was overcast and lowering. She felt a heaviness sink into her chest and sighed. Not wanting to look out on the gray day, she let the curtain fall and went downstairs. Calicos gave her a warm smile as she entered the little parlor, but it faltered as he noticed her pallor.
"Didn't sleep well?"
She shook her head. "You?"
"Well enough, though I was troubled with bad dreams. I blame your chef. That dinner tasted delicious, but obviously there was a fragment of an underdone potato hiding in there somewhere."
Despite the direness of the situation, Jaina found herself chuckling a little. "Then you are welcome to conjure all our meals, and that will teach you to complain," she said, chiding him teasingly. He gave her a look of mock horror. Their eyes met, and they both sobered.
"It seems wrong to joke," Jaina said with a sigh.
She began the preparation of the tea, measuring it out precisely as she always did, and setting the kettle to boil.
"It might seem wrong,"
Calic said in agreement, helping himself to the eggs, boar sausage, and hot porridge, despite his earlier teasing disparagement of the chef's abilities.
"But it isn't."
"Surely humor is inappropriate at times."
Jaina fixed her own plate and sat down next to Calic.
"At times," he said, digging into the sausage. "But joy is never inappropriate. Not real joy. Not the sort of lightness in the soul that makes the burdens bearable."
He gave her a sideways glance as he chewed and swallowed.
"I didn't give you and Kindy the full quote that heard isn't the right word. Received, possibly, from Norgannon."
The kettle began to sing. Jaina rose to tend to it, pouring tea for both of them.
"Really? Why not?"
"Miss Kindy didn't seem in the right frame of mind to receive it properly."
She handed him the tea and sat back down.
"And I am?"
An odd look crossed his face.
"Perhaps."
"Then tell me."
He closed his eyes, and again his voice changed, became deeper, became other.
"I believe that you will find that my gift to you is not just a profound duty, which it is, but also a delight, which it is. May you be dutiful and joyous both."
Jaina felt a strange twinge in her heart at the words. She realized she'd been silent, staring into Calic's eyes for several seconds, when he quirked a blue eyebrow, inviting a response from her. She looked down at her bowl, stirring her porridge.
"I was telling Kindy the truth. I enjoyed studying," she said, stammering a little. "I loved it, actually. Loved everything about Dalaran."
Her lips curved in remembrance.
"I remember humming as I went about my tasks," she added, laughing as her cheeks warmed with embarrassment. "The scents, the sunlight, the sheer fun of learning and practicing and finally mastering spells, of curling up with cheese and apples and scrolls."
"Joy,"
Calic said quietly. She supposed it was. It was sweet to linger in that long-ago moment. Then another memory crystallized. Kael'thas had approached her one such day, and then later, Arthas. The smile faded.
"What happened?"
Calic asked gently.
"The sun went behind a cloud."
Jaina pressed her lips together.
"Just, we all have ghosts. Maybe even dragons do."
"Ah,"
he said, regarding her with compassion.
"You think of ones you loved and lost."
She forced herself to eat more porridge, though the normally tasty breakfast food was now like sludge in her mouth, and nodded.
"Perhaps of Arthas."
Jaina swallowed hard, then started to say something to change the subject, but Calic pressed on.
"We do all have ghosts, Jaina. Even dragons, even aspects. Grief for her ghost nearly destroyed Alexstrasza, the great life-binder herself."
"Corialstras," she said. "Crassus. I saw him many times when he was at Dalaran, but never really knew him. Had no idea who he truly was."
"Hardly anyone did. And yes, Corialstras. He gave his life to save all of us, and at first we thought him a traitor."
"Including you and Alexstrasza?"
"We didn't want it to, but doubt crept into even our hearts."
Calic admitted this reluctantly.
"And I have my own ghosts too, Jaina. One is a human girl. With," he added, giving her a little nod, "fair hair and a great heart. She was so much more than just a girl, though. She was something beautiful and profound and unspeakably powerful. But her time as a simple young woman infused that power with compassion and love."
Jaina didn't look at him. She knew of whom he spoke, Anvina, who'd been the Sunwell incarnate. Jaina was familiar with what had happened to Anvina. The girl who was not a girl had sacrificed one form for her true one, and in doing so, sacrificed her life.
Another is a dragon, lovely as ice and sunlight, who was intended to be my mate.
He seemed to recall Jaina's presence and gave her a quick smile.
I don't think you'd get along with her particularly well. She never understood my interest in the,
lesser races?
I've never called you that,
Calic said, and for the first time, Jaina saw a spark of anger in the blue dragon.
Those who are not dragons are not lesser. It took Tirigosa a while to see that. You were simply different from us, and maybe in some ways better than us.
Jaina raised her golden brows. How in the world can you possibly say that? He smiled.
Cheese and apples and scrolls, he said. And thus you knew true, simple joy when you hadn't even entered your second decade. That, to me, makes you astonishing.
Chapter 6. It was not long before the explicit directives came. Bane hated what he was about to do, but if he refused, Garrosh would turn on him, and the Tauren, with the full force of the rest of the Horde behind him. Bane harbored no illusions of the idealism of the Forsaken, the Blood Elves, or the Goblins. They had their own agendas. The Orcs were traditional friends to the Tauren, but there were few malcontents. And the Trolls simply couldn't risk it. If the Tauren defied Garrosh so blatantly as to refuse this order, they would stand alone. Bane crushed the missive in his hand and turned a bleak expression to Hamul Runetotem.
Let us prepare,
the High Chieftain said.
At the very least, this part of the war Garrosh is getting us into has some scent of justice behind it.
The orders had been clear. Bane was to bring at least 24 braves, kodos, and weapons of war, and approach Northwatch Hold from the west. The Trolls would join them, though the trek from the Echo Isles to Mulgore was a long one. The Orcs would be marching from Orgrimmar, and the Forsaken, the Goblins, and the Blood Elves would take ships to meet them in the port town of Ratchet, and then they would all move swiftly to rendezvous with the Tauren at Northwatch Hold. Once, there had been only the dry land of the Barrens between Mulgore and Northwatch, and a little town called Camp Tarajo. Back then, the greatest problem had been fighting the Quillboar. Now, Bane would need to march his people past the ruins of Tarajo and through what had become known as the Fields of Blood. Following the orders he so disliked, Bane amassed his people on their side of the Great Gate as quietly as possible. They stood silently as instructed, the only sound the slight creaking of armor and the occasional stamp of a kodo. Bane could feel the tension. He marveled that the Alliance on the other side could not sense it as well. He had sent several scouts ahead to make sure that the Alliance recon would be taken unawares, and they had all reported back that only a few kept watch at this hour. 2 Tauren, taking care not to be seen, ascended the viewing platforms and made their own longer-distance reconnaissance. They could see better than humans in the dark, and besides, the Alliance soldiers were often foolish enough to keep campfires burning.
"High Chieftain," said one of the scouts,
forcing his voice to be soft.
"The Trolls, the hills are thick with them. They only await your order." "The number of soldiers is no greater than usual, judging by the fires," said another. "They are not expecting an attack."
Bane's heart ached at what he was about to do.
"Report back to Vol'jin. Tell him his people may attack at will. Once they have engaged the Alliance, we will open the Great Gate and follow up with our own weapons."
The scout nodded, turning and climbing up the hill at the juncture where the gate met it. Bane looked out over the assembled crowd of Tauren, their shapes barely visible in the light of the few torches they bore. There were several dozen braves and many others who would serve vital purposes when the conflict came in but a few seconds. Druids, shaman, healers, and other fighters of all kinds. He lifted his arm, making sure that it was seen, and waited. His heart beat quickly. 1, 2, 3. And then came the blood-chilling war cries. The trolls had attacked. Bane snapped his arm down. From the other side of the gate, with a clang of weaponry, the defiant shouts of humans and dwarves, and the thud of ballista arrows striking home. On this side of the gate, 2 Tauren grunted and strained, their massive bodies trembling with the effort as the thick ropes were laboriously pulled and the gate groaned. The Northwatch soldiers were taken completely by surprise. Tauren braves streamed through, bellowing and hurling themselves into the fray. The humans and dwarves didn't stand a chance. They were vastly outnumbered by furred and green and blue-skinned bodies, and their weapons, while dangerous, needed time to be directed and prepped. There was no time for anything but desperate and ill-fated resistance. One foolish soldier charged Bane himself, crying, "For the Alliance!" His simple military-issue sword snapped as Bane swung his mace. The piece went flying, flashing brightly in the faint light, and then was swallowed up by darkness. Bane swung again. The soldier's chainmail armor offered no protection from the blunt instrument. The body hurtled a distance away from the force of the blow. There were a few more shouts from Tauren and trolls, and then the clang of weaponry ceased.
"Trolls, hold!" Vol'jin ordered. "Tauren, to me!" Bane shouted. There was a pause, and then whoops of triumph filled the night air. Bane looked around. It was over, mere moments after it had started. "This bodes well for the attack," Vol'jin said. Bane shook his head. "Not if any alliance escaped. Under the cloak of night, they could warn Northwatch hold." "Then we best be about getting to Northwatch." They took a moment to select a few scouts to go ahead and report back as the rest of the Troll and Tauren army regrouped and began the march east toward Northwatch. Vol'jin pulled his raptor up alongside Bane's Kodo as they went. "After we left Orgrimmar," Vol'jin said, "some of the orcs that were nodding their heads when Ole Trig was talking been kinda absent." Bane felt a jolt surge through him. "Garrosh is executing those who don't agree with him?" "Not yet. Them Cochrane, especially that grey-skinned one, they be walking through the streets, just waiting to overhear something they don't like. If they do, well, some they arrest right on the spot. Some they come for all quiet. That mushroom seller, he closed shop for a few days. He come back looking all beat up, like he be in the wrong end of a fight. And some, they don't come back at all." "Political prisoners?" Vol'jin nodded. "We trolls be keeping our mouths shut." Bane grunted. "Perhaps if Garrosh knew what the Corcoran are up to. He is a hothead, but surely he cannot be ordering this." Vol'jin made a dismissive sound and waved a gangly arm in disgust. "No one gets to Garrosh. I hear that even Itrig only sees him when Garrosh feels like it, and then that boy surrounded by his big old bodyguards. He be all, 'The Horde can do this, the Horde can do that,' all confident without any reason for it. I can't say for certain that he knows what's going on, but I can't say for certain that he don't. Either way, I be more scared of Orgrimmar these days than the darkest voodoo." "Then there is no stopping him, no reaching him, no reasoning, and insanity abounds." "That's about the size of it, mon." Bane growled softly, looking over his troops. An idea was forming. It was audacious, it was risky, and it might cost him dearly. But it might save the Tauren people. It might even save the Horde. "Why can't we find anything?" The words burst as if of their own volition from Jaina, and she wished them back as soon as she had uttered them. Kalik, Turvosh, and Kindi
who'd returned from Dalaran with 2 entire trunks full of scrolls, magical items, and books that the Kirin Tor thought might help, all looked up from their various studies and stared at her. She bit her lip. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm usually not like this." Turvosh gave her a kind smile.
"No, lady, you're not," he said. "But then again, this is hardly a usual situation."
Normally, she was both idealist and pragmatist. Practical was what Arthas had dubbed her. The combination was part of what made her such a skilled mage. Her curious mind worked methodically around a problem until it was solved. It served her well in diplomatic endeavors, too. While she cared deeply about the outcome of what she worked toward, she also worked toward it. She didn't just stomp her foot, or weep, or say whiny things like, "Why can't we find anything?"
"The Archmage is correct," Kalikos said. "We're all under a lot of strain. Perhaps we should take a brief respite."
"We broke for lunch," Kindy said.
4 hours ago, Kalik reminded her. "Since then, we've not stretched or moved or done anything but stare at books. We may have lost the ability to even spot something if we do come across it."
Jaina rubbed her aching eyes. "I apologize again. Kalik may have hit on the very reason for why we haven't found anything." She put a little extra emphasis on the words to let them all know that she was fully aware of how she had sounded. "I don't think," Kindy began.
"You're young," Turvosh said. "You can go forever. We old folks need our little breaks. You're welcome to stay here and keep perusing the documents, Kindy, but I'm going to go and work in the garden for a bit. There are some herbs that need harvesting."
He rose and pressed his hands to his back. There was an audible crack. Jaina knew she too would creak as she rose after sitting in one position for too long. She and Turvosh were not, as he had joked, old folks, but the seemingly endless energy of her youth, which had sustained her through her ordeals with the plague and the war with demons, appeared to elude her now that she had reached 30.
"Care to show me around?"
asked Kalik, interrupting her thoughts. She started. "Oh, yes, of course." She rose, attempting to cover her embarrassment at being caught wool-gathering. "I am very proud of the order and harmony we have here in Proudmoore. The cataclysm damaged the city, but we rebuilt with a will." They descended the long, winding stairs of Jaina's tower and stepped out into a surprisingly sunny day. Jaina nodded to the guards, who saluted smartly, and to the mounted lieutenant, Aiden. Kalikos looked about with open interest. "Over there is Foothold Citadel," Jaina said. There was a training area on their right as they walked by where Theramore's guards fought against practice dummies, their swords thunking against wood. Coming from their left, however, were the bright sounds of steel clashing against steel as the young recruits trained in the open air. Their commanders barked orders, while priests watched carefully, ready to call upon the light for healing the instant anyone was injured.
"It's rather martial," Kalik observed.
"We're at the entrance to a very dangerous swamp on one side, and the ocean on the other," Jaina said. They continued to walk, turning away from the practicing warriors and passing the inn. "We've got a lot to protect against."
"The Horde, obviously."
She gave him a look. "We are the most martial alliance presence on the continent, but honestly, the majority of the danger comes from the wildlife and various unsavory characters." Kalik put a hand to his chest and widened his eyes in feigned shock and hurt. Jaina smiled. "Don't worry. The only dragons I take issue with are the black dragons in the swamp," she said. "The Horde seems to keep to itself, as long as we do, and that's an arrangement I can live with, although there are many who don't understand that."
"Is the Alliance pressing for war?"
Kalik asked quietly. Jaina grimaced. "Ah, now you've found a sore spot," she said. "We'll discuss that later. How are your blues faring, Kalik? Most magi may resent them, as Kindy did, but I know you've undergone a great deal. First the Nexus War, then finding and losing an aspect, then this theft."
"Now you have found a sore spot,"
Kalik said, but his voice was kind. My apologies, Jaina said. Their path was leading them out of the city, the cobblestones becoming less well-tended and slightly muddy. I meant no offense. And here I am, supposed to be a diplomat.
No offense was taken, and a good diplomat can often see clearly what is troubling another, Calic said. It has indeed been difficult. For so many ages, dragons were among the most powerful beings in Azeroth. We alone had the aspects to guard our flights in the world. Even the least of us had a life that must seem impossibly long to you, and abilities that made many of my race feel superior. Deathwing, what is the phrase you humans use? Gave us a good helping of humble cake.
Jaina fought to keep from laughing. I think the phrase is usually humble pie. He chuckled.
It would seem that, even though I like the younger races more than most of my kin do, I still have a lot to learn.
Jaina waved her hand. Human slang should not be high on your list of things to master, she said.
I wish I could say that I had nothing more pressing to do,
Calic replied, sobering again.
Halt!
A voice cried sharply. Calicgo stopped, looking at Jaina with curiosity as several guards approached with drawn swords and axes. Jaina waved at them, and they immediately put away their weapons and bowed as they recognized her. One of them, a fair-haired, bearded man, saluted.
Lady Jaina, he said. I wasn't informed that you and your guest would be passing through. Do you wish an escort?
The two magi exchanged slightly amused glances. Thank you, Captain Wymore. I appreciate the offer, but I think this gentleman will be able to protect me, Jaina said, keeping a straight face.
As you will, my lady.
Calic waited until they had passed out of earshot, before saying, in a completely serious tone of voice,
I don't know, Jaina. I might be the one who needs rescuing.
Why, then, I shall come to your rescue, Jaina said, keeping her face as serious as his. Calic sighed.
You were already doing so,
he said quietly. She glanced up at him, her brow furrowing. I'm helping, she said. I'm not rescuing.
In a way, you are. You all are. We're not what we were. I want so much to protect my flight, to take care of them.
Something clicked in Jaina's mind. As you wanted to protect Anvina. A muscle twitched in his cheek, but his steps didn't falter.
Yes.
You didn't fail her.
Yes, I did. She was captured and used, Calic said, his voice harsh with self-loathing. Used to try to bring Kil'jaeden into Azeroth. And I couldn't save her.
You had no control over that, if what I understand is true, Jaina said softly, feeling her way. She wasn't sure how much Calicos was ready to share with her. You were possessed yourself by a dreadlord, and once you were freed from that horrible existence, you went to her.
But I couldn't do anything. I couldn't stop them from hurting her.
Yes, you did, Jaina said, pressing him. You let Anvina become what she really was, the Sunwell. And because of your love and her courage, Kil'jaeden was defeated. You were selfless enough not to deny her destiny.
And the aspects were destined to lose our powers in order for us to succeed against Deathwing. I know, Calic said. It's not wrong what is going on, but it is hard. It is hard to watch their hope failing and...
To know yours is failing as well. He turned sharply to look at her, and for a moment she thought she had gone too far. But it was not anger in his eyes, it was anguish.
You, he said, are not nearly as old as I. How is it you are so insightful?
She hooked her arm through his as they walked. Because I'm wrestling with the same thing.
Why are you here, Jaina? He asked.
She raised a golden eyebrow at his bluntness.
I've heard that you are considered one of the finest magi of the Order. Why are you not in Dalaran? Why are you here, standing between swamp and ocean, between Horde and Alliance?
Because someone has to.
Truly?
His brow was furrowed. He came to a stop and turned her to face him. Of course, she retorted. Anger rose in her.
Do you want war between the Alliance and Horde, Calic? Is that what the dragons have decided to do with their time these days? Go around stirring up trouble? His blue eyes showed hurt from the blow her words had landed. She winced. I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Calic nodded.
What did you mean, then?
He asked, but there was no rancor in his voice. She stared at him mutely. She didn't know. Then words came tumbling out from somewhere. I didn't want to be part of the Order after Dalaran fell. After Antonidas died. Arthas killed him, Calic. Killed so many of them. The man I'd once thought I would marry, had loved. I couldn't be around that. I had changed, and the Kirin Tor had changed too. They're more than simply neutral. I think, perhaps without realizing it, they may look down on anyone who's not one of them. I had learned that to really foster peace, you have to embrace the people, all of them. And although I was the last one to suspect it, I do have diplomatic gifts, she said earnestly. The hurt was gone from his kind face, and he lifted one hand to stroke her golden hair, almost as if he were comforting a child.
Jaina, he asked, if you believe that, and I am not saying you're wrong, why are you trying so very hard to convince yourself?
And there it was. He had plunged a dagger in her heart, keen and sharp and so painful that she gasped as if it were a physical blow. She stared up at him, unable to drag her gaze away, feeling tears sting her eyes. They don't listen, she said, barely audible. No one listens. Not Varian, not Thrall, certainly not Garrosh. I feel that I am standing alone on a cliff, and the wind snatches the words from my lips even as I speak them. No matter what I do, no matter what I say, it is all pointless. It has no meaning. I have no meaning. As she spoke, she saw a sad smile of recognition touch Calic's lips.
And so this we share, Lady Jaina Proudmoore, Calic said. We fear being of no use, of no help. All that we have known to do is useless.
The tears spilled down her cheeks. Gently he wiped them away.
But I do know this much. There is a rhythm, a cycle to such things. Nothing stays the same, Jaina. Not even dragons so long-lived and supposedly so wise. How much, then, must humans change? Once, you were an eager young apprentice, curious and studious, content to stay in Dalaran and master your spells. Then the world came and ripped you away from your safe place. You changed. You survived, even thrived, in the new role of a diplomat. You had puzzles and challenges, but of a different variety, and that is how you served. This world...
He shook his head sadly, looking up into the sky.
This world is not as it was. No thing, no one is as it was. Here, let me show you something.
He lifted his hands, his long, clever fingers moving. Arcane energy sparked from his fingertips. It formed a whirling ball, hovering in front of them.
Look at this, he said.
Jaina did, forcing her foolish tears. Where had they come from, down, and focusing on the little orb of arcane magic? Deftly Calic touched it. It seemed to shatter, and then reform, with a difference. There! It's a pattern, Jaina said, marveling.
Watch again, Calic said.
A second time he touched it, a third. Each time the patterns became clearer. There was a moment when, baffled and enraptured both, Jaina wondered if she was looking at a gnomish schematic rather than a ball of arcane energy. Signs and symbols and numbers whirled, then jumbled together, then arranged themselves in a certain formation. It's so beautiful, she whispered. Calic splayed his fingers and drew his hand through the orb. As if it were mist he disturbed, it fragmented, then reformed in still another way. It was a ceaselessly shifting kaleidoscope of magic, of precise patterns and order.
Do you understand, Jaina? He asked.
She continued to stare, almost hypnotized by the exquisite patterns of formation, shattering and reconfiguration. "It's more than spells," she said. He nodded.
"It's what spells are made of."
For a moment, she didn't follow him. Spells had incantations, gesticulation, sometimes reagents. And then understanding smote her so powerfully, she almost stumbled with the revelation.
"It's math." "Equations, theorems, order," Calix said, pleased. "Combined in one way, they're one thing. In another, something altogether different. It is fixed and mutable, as is a life. All things change, Jaina, whether from the inside out or the outside in. Sometimes with only a single shift in a variable."
"And we are magic too," Jaina whispered. She tore her gaze from the ineffably beautiful swirl of lyrical, poetical math and began to form a question.
"Lady Jaina!"
The shout startled them both, and they turned to see Captain Wymore galloping toward them on a bay horse. He pulled the beast up so sharply it reared and mouthed the bit. "Captain Wymore, what—" Jaina began, but the guard cut her off.
"Pained has returned with news," he said,
panting from the short but intense ride.
"The Horde, they are gathering, coming from Orgrimmar and Ratchet as well as from Mulgore. It looks like they are set to converge on Northwatch Hold."
"No," Jaina breathed, her heart, an instant ago so buoyed by the beauty and insight Calicos had shared with her, now heavy in her chest. "Please, no, not this, not now." Chapter 7. It was old Dirty Pete's turn to keep watch in Corporal Tegan's expedition encampment, located on the edge of the mysterious jungle overgrowth, which had seemingly sprung up overnight. Despite his fondness for a mug of the brew, on, well, nearly an hourly basis, the white-bearded dwarf knew enough to take his assignments seriously. He hadn't had anything to drink since nightfall, and it was nearly dawn. He patted his blunderbuss, which he loved, even if it was becoming a bit erratic these days. Unkind folks said it was old Dirty Pete who was erratic, not his gun, and sighed. Soon his watch would be over, and he could open up that cherry grog he'd been saving for. There was a rustle in the undergrowth. The old dwarf got to his feet with more speed than most would have given him credit for. All kinds of strange critters could be attacking. Raptors, plain striders, those big, nasty flower or moss things. A woman, wearing a tabard that sported a golden anchor, stumbled forward, stared at him a moment, and then collapsed. Pete barely caught her as she fell.
"Tegan!" roared Pete. "We got ourselves a problem."
A few seconds later, one of the guards was attempting to bandage the young scout's injuries, but Pete thought, sadly, that it was pretty clear the little missy wasn't going to pull through. She reached out frantically, grabbing onto Hannah Bridgewater's arm as Hannah bent over her.
"The Horde,"
the scout rasped.
"Doran opened the gate, heading east, think Northwatch."
Her eyes closed, and her black hair, matted with blood, fell back limply against Pete's broad chest. He patted her shoulder awkwardly.
"You got your message through, lass," he said. "You done good. Take your rest now."
Tegan, hurrying up in response to Pete's call, shot the dwarf an angry look.
"She's dead, you idiot."
Gently, Pete replied.
"I know, laddie, I know."
2 minutes later, the fastest one among them, Hannah, was running as quickly as her long, strong legs would carry her, east to Northwatch, praying to the light that she wouldn't be too late. Admiral Tarlin Aubrey was, as usual, awake before dawn. He rose swiftly, splashed water on his face, dressed and shaved. As he met his own eyes in the mirror, he saw that they had circles underneath them, and frowned as he carefully shaped the beard and mustache that were his only concessions to physical vanity. Over the last few days, the Rage War clan of orcs had appeared to be regrouping, what was left of them. Skirmishes had broken out, during which it had been reported that a few of the orcs had shouted insults along the lines that the Alliance would get what was coming to it, or had grunted defiant comments as they died, such as, "My death will be avenged." Nothing out of the ordinary, not really. Confidence and arrogance marked almost every orc in Aubrey's experience, and the Rage Roar in particular. And yet, he had not gotten to his position without being alert to all possible dangers. It was odd that the Rage Roar had come back after being defeated, and he needed to know why. He had sent out spies to confirm if the Horde was beginning to move toward war, and especially if its sights were on Northwatch hold. None had reported in yet. It was too early. Aubrey broke his fast with a banana and some strong tea and headed to his usual patrol route. He nodded a greeting to Signal Officer Nathan Blaine, who saluted smartly despite the early hour, and together the two men looked out over the sea. Dawn was full on, and the ocean and dock were painted in shades of rose, scarlet, and crimson, the clouds hovering above, limned faintly with gold here and there.
"Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning," Aubrey mused as he sipped his tea. "Red sky at night, sailors delight," Blaine finished. "But we're not sailing today, sir."
He gave the Admiral a lopsided but still respectful grin.
"True enough,"
said Aubrey.
"But we're always sailors. Keep an eye out, Nathan."
The Admiral's eyes narrowed a bit.
"There's something—"
He pursed his lips, shaking his head, then turned and descended the tower quickly. He left the sentence unfinished.
"A tad superstitious, isn't he, now?"
said a dwarven guard to Blaine.
"Perhaps," said Nathan, turning back to the bay. "But I bet you still always step onto a ship with your right foot first, don't you?"
Said the dwarf, his cheeks flushing a bit red.
"Aye. No sense in inviting bad luck now, is there?"
Nathan grinned. They were a sea of green and brown, moving steadily down the gold road through the northern barrens toward Ratchet. Most of the orcs were on foot, though a few of the elite, including the Corcron, Malkorok, and the war chief himself, rode wolves. Some were mounted on Kodos, the better to manage the drums of war that were sending a trembling pounding through the very earth itself. Word had gone ahead, of course, so that at each town more could gather and join the march on Northwatch. Those who would not participate in the active battle, and they were few, the elderly, the very young, the mothers of suckling babes, nonetheless ran out to cheer Garrosh and his unquestioned victory. Garrosh, tall and proud on his black-furred, muscular wolf, raised Gorehowl in response to the cheers, but seldom dismounted. The pace of the march enabled the army to be seen from far enough away for the warriors, magi, healers, and shaman to fall in step without slowing down the river of horde that flowed along the road. As they left the crossroads, where their numbers had swelled, Malkorok brought his mount alongside Garrosh's. He thumped his chest in a salute, and Garrosh nodded acknowledgement.
"Any word?" Garrosh asked. "It seems that Bane is indeed loyal to us, for the present," said Malkorok. "He and the trolls slew the Alliance scouts that hovered at the Great Gate, and now march east to Northwatch, as they said they would."
Garrosh turned to Malkorok.
"I commend you for your watchfulness, Malkorok," he said. "Surely now you see that I hold Bane in the palm of my hand. He is devoted to his people, and would not risk them. He knows that I suffer no such hesitation when it comes to the Tauren. His protectiveness of them is a trait to both admire and hold in contempt. And," he added, "to use." "Even so, he spoke out so brazenly," Malkorok growled. "Indeed," said Garrosh. "But he comes through when he is needed, as do Vol'jin and Lorthamar and Sylvanas." And Gallywix.
Garrosh made a face.
He is out only for profit, and is as subtle as a charging Kodo about it. As long as the Horde lines his purse, he will be loyal.
Would that all our allies were so transparent.
Leave Bane be for now, said Garrosh.
This is the task you set me to, Great War Chief, said Malcrock. To root out those who would defy your leadership, and thus become traitors to the glorious Horde.
But if we are too suspicious of our allies, their patience will grow thin, retorted Garrosh. No, Malcrock, the time is now to fight the Alliance, not each other. And what a fight it will be!
And if Bane or Vol'jin or others do plot against you?
If you have proof rather than irritated words, then, as always, you have free rein, which I know well you've already exercised.
Malcrock's grey lips curved in a smile that was as malevolent as it was ugly. The ships, Forsaken, Blood Elf, Goblin, had come early to Ratchet, and Garrosh could barely contain his excitement at the sight. Ratchet's harbor was crowded with them, and Garrosh's hot anticipation of the certain bloodbath to come was quelled slightly as he realized that it would take some time to unload all the troops and supplies he had requested. This was the part of being war chief that he found tiresome, but it couldn't be helped. The arrival of the orcs did not go unnoticed, despite the activity in the harbor, and cheers went up. Garrosh waved and dismounted as 3 figures approached. One, he knew, the corpulent and sly trade prince Gallywix. The others, a blood elf and a Forsaken, he did not, and he frowned.
"War Chief Garrosh," said Gallywix enthusiastically, his piggy eyes bright and his arms outstretched in welcome. By the ancestors, Garrosh thought, with a stab of repugnance, did the goblin think to embrace him? He forestalled the gesture by turning to the blood elf. She had golden hair and pale skin, and wore the bright, gleaming armor that marked her as one of her people's paladins. "Where is Lorthamar?" Garrosh asked bluntly. Her full lips pressed together in irritation, but when she spoke, her voice was calm and pleasant. "He has sent me to oversee the Blood Elf troops. My name is Callantyr Bloodblade. I trained with the Lady Liadrin, and I served under Ranger General Haldoran Brightwing."
"Neither of whom is here," said Malcrock,
stepping protectively near Garrosh.
"Instead, we have this little third-ranking whelp."
Callantyr turned coolly to Malcrock. "You also have 2 ships filled with blood elves willing to fight and die for the Horde," she said. "Unless you are so sufficient in numbers and supplies that our feeble support will not be necessary." Garrosh had never much cared for blood elves, and this female was getting under his skin.
"You have a chance to prove your people's worth in battle today," he said. "Take care you do not squander it." "My people are familiar with war and battles and sacrifice, War Chief Garrosh," snapped Callantyr. "You will not find us lacking." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to the docks, her plate mail. How can she even bear it on such a tiny, twig-fragile frame, Garrosh wondered, clanking slightly as she strode. "War Chief!" interjected Gallywix, but Malcrock silenced the loquacious goblin with a single glance. Garrosh directed his attention to the Forsaken, who, in contrast to the arrogance displayed by the Blood Elf, bowed almost obsequiously low. He was a warrior of sorts, if the blade sheathed at his bony hip was any indication. He had no hair, it apparently had rotted off by this point, and his skin was a pale green.